Pakistan, A Hard Country by Anatol Lieven. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Part 1, Land, People, and History. Chapter 1, Introduction, Understanding Pakistan. Chapter 2, The Struggle for Muslim South Asia. Pakistan. A Hard Country. Anatol Lieven. Part 1, Land, People, and History. Chapter 1. Understanding Pakistan. Part 1. Land, People, and History 1. Introduction, Understanding Pakistan. Epper si move, and yet it moves. Galileo Galilei. There have been times during the writing of this book when it seemed that it would have to be titled Requiem for a Country. At the time of writing, the pressures on Pakistan from without and within are unprecedented even in its troubled history. Yet such despair would be premature. Tariq Ali wrote, "Can Pakistan survive?" The death of a state in 1983, a generation ago. That's quite a long deathbed scene by any standards. Point 1. It is possible that the terrible floods of the summer of 2010 have fundamentally changed and weakened the Pakistani system described in this book. This, however, will not be clear for a long while, and in the meantime it is worth remembering the extraordinary resilience that South Asian rural societies have often shown in the face of natural disaster, from which they have repeatedly emerged with structures of local authority and political culture essentially unchanged. What is certainly true is that if floods and other ecological disasters on this scale become regular events, as a result of climate change, then Pakistan will be destroyed as a state and an organized society, but so too will many other countries around the world. Indeed, such a development would reduce present concerns about Pakistan to relative insignificance. In the meantime, however, the floods have obviously damaged Pakistan's national infrastructure and retarded still further the country's already faltering economic progress. This book is intended to describe and analyze both Pakistan's internal problems and the sources of Pakistan's internal resilience. In consequence, it of course deals extensively with the threat from the Pakistani Taliban and their allies, the roots of their support, and the relationship of this support to the war in Afghanistan. It also examines the policies of the Pakistani security establishment towards Afghanistan and India, since these have had very important effects on domestic developments in Pakistan. It is not meant, however, to be a study of Pakistan's international position, though the conclusions contain some recommendations for Western policy. Trying to understand Pakistan's internal structures and dynamics is complicated, for if there is one phrase which defines many aspects of Pakistan and is the central theme of this book, it is Janus-faced. In other words, many of the same features of Pakistan's state and government which are responsible for holding Islamist extremism in check, are at one and the same time responsible for holding back Pakistan's social, economic and political development. Pakistan is divided, disorganized, economically backward, corrupt, violent, unjust, often savagely oppressive towards the poor and women, and home to extremely dangerous forms of extremism and terrorism, and yet it moves, and is in many ways surprisingly tough and resilient as a state and a society. It is also not quite as unequal as it looks from outside. Pakistan contains islands of successful modernity, and of excellent administration, not that many, but enough to help keep the country trundling along, a few impressive modern industries, some fine motorways, a university in Lahore, parts of which are the best of their kind in South Asia, a powerful, well-trained and well-disciplined army, and in every generation, a number of efficient, honest and devoted public servants. The military and police commanders of the fight against the Taliban in the Pathan areas, whom I met in Peshawar and Rawalpindi in 2008-9, struck me as highly able and patriotic men by any standards in the world. The National Finance Commission Award of 2010, which rebalanced state revenues in favor of the poorer provinces, was a reasonable if belated agreement. It demonstrated that Pakistani democracy, the Pakistani political process, and Pakistani federalism retain a measure of vitality, flexibility, and the ability to compromise. None of these things is characteristic of truly failed or failing states like Somalia, Afghanistan, or the Congo. That doesn't mean that Pakistan always smells nice, though sometimes it does, and indeed, some of the toughest creepers holding the rotten tree of the Pakistani system together are at one and the same time parasites on that tree, and sometimes smell bad even by their own standards. Nonetheless, tough they are, and unless the USA, India, or both together invade Pakistan and thereby precipitate its disintegration, the likelihood is that the country will hold together, and that if it eventually collapses, it will be not Islamist extremism but climate change, an especially grim threat in the whole of South Asia, that finishes it off. Support for extremist and terrorist groups is scattered throughout Pakistani society, but as of 2010, mass support for Islamist rebellion against the Pakistani state is so far present only in the Pathan areas, and in only some of them, in other words, less than 5% of the population. That is not remotely enough to revolutionize Pakistan as a whole. During their rule over the region, the British faced repeated revolts in the Pathan areas, without seriously fearing that this would lead to rebellion elsewhere in their Indian empire. Any Pakistani national revolution would have to gain not just mass but majority support in Pakistan's two great urban centers, Lahore and Karachi, and as the chapters on Punjab and Sindh will make clear, this is unlikely for the foreseeable future, though not necessarily forever, especially if ecological crisis floods the cities with masses of starving peasants. When terrorist groups attack India, or Western forces in Afghanistan, their actions enjoy a degree of instinctive, gut sympathy from a majority of Pakistanis, not because of Islamist extremism, but because of Muslim nationalism and bitter hostility to the U.S. role in the Muslim world in general and Pakistan's region in particular. Support for a civil war and revolution in Pakistan itself that would turn Pakistan into a revolutionary Islamic state is, however, a very different matter from sympathizing with attacks on the US and India. That would mean Pakistanis killing Pakistanis on a massive scale, and by and large they don't want to. They may well want to kill some set of immediate rivals, but that's another matter. It is important not to be misled by the spread of terrorism in Pakistan in 2009-10. In many ways, terrorism by the Pakistani Taliban is a sign not of strength but of weakness. If you want to overthrow and capture a state, you need either a mass movement on city streets that seizes institutions, or a guerrilla movement in the countryside that seizes territory, or a revolt of the junior ranks of the military, or some combination of all three. No movement relying chiefly on terrorism has ever overthrown a state. The Pakistani Taliban looked truly menacing when it took over most of the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, followed by the districts of Swat and Buner. When it blows up ordinary people in bazaars and mosques, it merely looks foul. Pakistan is thus probably still far from the situation of Iran in the late 1970s or Russia in 1917. Apart from anything else, the army is a united and disciplined institution, and as long as that remains the case, it will be strong enough to defeat open revolt, as it proved by defeating the Taliban in Swat and South Waziristan in 2009. Unlike in Africa and elsewhere, Military coups in Pakistan have always been carried out by the army as a whole, on the orders of its chief of staff and commanding generals, never by junior officers. As my chapter on the military will describe, there are very deep reasons for this in terms of material advantage as well as military culture. The only thing that can destroy this discipline and unity is if enough Pakistani soldiers are faced with moral and emotional pressures, powerful enough to crack their discipline, and that would mean very powerful pressures indeed. In fact, they would have to be put in a position where their duty to defend Pakistan and their conscience and honor as Muslims clashed directly with their obedience to their commanders. As far as I can see, the only thing that could bring that about as far as the army as a whole is concerned, rather than just some of its Pathan elements, is if the US were to invade part of Pakistan, and the army command failed to give orders to resist this. Already, the perceived subservience of the Pakistani state to Washington's demands has caused severe problems of morale in the armed forces. I have been told by soldiers of all ranks that faced with open incursions on the ground by U.S. troops, parts of the Pakistani army would mutiny in order to fight the invaders. With the army splintered and radicalized, Islamist upheaval and the collapse of the state would indeed be all too likely, but even then, the result would be rebellions leading to civil war, not, as in Iran, to a national revolution that would be successful in taking over the whole country. I hope through this book to strengthen the argument that however great the provocation, the US must not contribute to the destruction of Pakistan, even though, as this book will make clear, neither the Pakistani army, nor the Pakistani state, nor the great majority of Pakistanis will ever give more than very qualified help to the U.S. campaign against the Afghan Taliban, since Pakistanis of every rank and class see these in a quite different light from Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban. Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. Pakistan is quite simply far more important to the region, the West, and the world than is Afghanistan. A statement which is a matter not of sentiment but of mathematics. With more than 180 million people, Pakistan has nearly 6 times the population of Afghanistan, or Iraq, twice the population of Iran, and almost 2/3 the population of the entire Arab world put together. Pakistan has a large diaspora in Britain, and therefore in the EU, some of whom have joined the Islamist extremists and carried out terrorist attacks against Britain. The help of the Pakistani intelligence services to Britain has been absolutely vital to identifying the links of these potential terrorists to groups in Pakistan, and to preventing more attacks on Britain, the USA, and Europe. Pakistan therefore has been only a partial ally in the war on terror, but still a vital and irreplaceable one. For we need to remember that in the end it is only legitimate Muslim governments and security services that can control terrorist plots on their soil. Western pressure may be necessary to push them in the right direction, but we need to be careful that this pressure does not become so overwhelming that it undermines or even destroys those governments, by humiliating them in the eyes of their own people. Finally, Pakistan possesses nuclear weapons and one of the most powerful armies in Asia. This means that the option of the US attacking Pakistan with ground forces in order to force it to put pressure on the Afghan Taliban simply does not exist, as both the Pentagon and the Pakistani military have long understood. Deeply unsatisfying though this has been for the West, the only means of influencing Pakistan has been through economic incentives and the threat of their withdrawal. Economic sanctions are not really a credible threat, because the economic collapse of Pakistan would play straight into the hands of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Pakistan's relationship with India has been central to Pakistan's behavior since 9/11. As of course it has been ever since partition and independence in 1947. Fear of India has both encouraged and limited Pakistani help to the U.S. in Afghanistan. This fear is exaggerated, but not irrational, and neither are most of the policies which result from it. On the one hand, fear of a U.S. Indian alliance against Pakistan seems to have been a genuine factor in Musharraf's decision to help the U.S. after September 11, and was certainly used by him to convince the military and, initially, many ordinary Pakistanis of the necessity of this help. On the other hand, fear of India has been both a reason and an excuse for Pakistan not to redeploy more troops from the eastern border, with India to fight against the Taliban in the west. Lastly, the Pakistani establishment long cherished the hope that it could use Pakistani help against the Taliban to bargain for U.S. pressure on India to reach a settlement with Pakistan over Kashmir. This hope has faded with the refusal, compounded of unwillingness and inability, of both the Bush and the Obama administrations to play such a role, but this refusal, and America's tilt towards India, have added greatly to long-standing Pakistani feelings of betrayal by the U.S. Pakistan's help to the West against the Afghan Taliban would, however, have been limited in any case both by strategic calculation and mass sentiment. In terms of mass sentiment, the overwhelming majority of Pakistanis, including the communities from which most Pakistani soldiers are drawn, see the Afghan Taliban as engaged in a legitimate war of resistance against foreign occupation, analogous to the Mujahideen War against Soviet occupation in the 1980s. In terms of strategy, the Pakistani establishment's approach to Afghanistan has long been driven by a mixture of fear and ambition. The fear is above all of Afghanistan, under the rule of the non-Pashtun nationalities, becoming an Indian client state, leading to India's strategic encirclement of Pakistan. This fear has been increased by a well-founded belief that India is supporting Pakistan's Baloch nationalist rebels via Afghanistan, and by what seems by contrast to be a purely paranoid conviction that India is also supporting the Pakistani Taliban. The greater part of the Pakistani establishment therefore believes that it needs to maintain close relations with the Afghan Taliban, since they are Pakistan's only potential allies in Afghanistan. In recent years, belief in the need for a relationship with the Taliban has been strengthened by the growing conviction that the West is going to fail in Afghanistan, and will eventually withdraw, leaving anarchy and civil war behind, just as occurred after the Soviet withdrawal and the fall of the communist regime from 1989-92. In the resulting civil war, it is believed, every regional state will have its own allies, and so must Pakistan. Incidentally, it is worth pointing out that even entirely secular members of the Pakistani establishment do not see the Afghan Taliban as morally worse than the Taliban's old enemies in the Afghan Northern Alliance leaders, with whom the West has in effect been allied since 2001. Their atrocities and rapes in the 1990s helped cement Pathan support for the Taliban. They massacred Taliban prisoners and looted Western aid after the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, and their role in the heroin trade has helped destroy any hope of the West curtailing that trade since 9/11. Equally, it is important to note that in the great majority of cases, both in the elites and in the mass of the population, this sympathy or support for the Afghan Taliban does not imply ideological approval, or any desire that Pakistan should experience a Taliban-style revolution, any more than support for the Mujahideen in the 1980s implied much liking for them. Hence, too, the great difference in Pakistani attitudes to the Afghan and to the Pakistani Taliban. There was never a chance that the Pakistani establishment and army were going to let the Pakistani Taliban conquer Pakistan. The long delay in fighting them seriously was because they were not generally regarded as a serious threat to Pakistan, but were seen as a local Pathan rebellion which could be contained by a mixture of force and negotiation, because many ordinary Pakistanis, including soldiers, saw them as misguided but nonetheless decent people dedicated to helping the good jihad in Afghanistan, because there was deep opposition to the state engaging in a Pakistani civil war for the sake of what were seen to be American interests, especially among all sections of Pakistan's Pathan population, and, finally, because the Pakistani military and its intelligence services were deeply entwined with jihadi groups which they had sponsored to fight against India in Kashmir, and which were in turn entwined with the Pakistani Taliban. As soon as the Pakistani Taliban were seen by the establishment to be a really serious threat to the central Pakistani state, in the spring of 2009, the army, with the backing of the PPP-led government and much of the establishment in general, took strong action to drive them back. The army's victories over the Pakistani Taliban in Swat and South Waziristan have settled the question of whether Pakistan will survive the Pakistani Taliban's assault, barring once again an attack by the US or full-scale war with India. They have, however, settled nothing when it comes to the question of the army's willingness to fight hard against the Afghan Taliban, for the sake of a Western victory in Afghanistan. Tougher than it looks. Failing a catastrophic overspill of the war in Afghanistan, Pakistan will therefore probably survive as a state. The destruction of United Pakistan and the separation of Bangladesh in 1971 are often cited as possible precedents for the future disintegration of today's Pakistan, but this is quite wrong. No freak of history like United Pakistan, its two ethnically and culturally very different wings separated by 1,000 miles of hostile India, could possibly have lasted for long, quite apart from the immense cultural and linguistic differences between the two halves. The tragedy is not that it failed, but that a situation made for a civilized divorce should instead have ended in horrible bloodshed. West Pakistan, by contrast, is far more of a natural unity in every way, with a degree of common history and ethnic intertwining stretching back long before British rule. Pakistan in its present shape has already survived considerably longer without Bangladesh, 38 years, than the original United Pakistan managed, 24 years. It is true that Pakistan, as a name, is a wholly artificial construct, invented by Remat Ali, an Indian Muslim student in Britain in 1933. To describe a future Muslim state in the northwest of the then British Empire of India, embracing Punjabis, Pathans, Kashmiris, Sindhis and the peoples of Balochistan, different parts of which names make up the word Pakistan. Pak, in turn, means pure in Urdu, and so Pakistan was to be the land of the pure. In the imagination of the coiners of this name, there was no thought of including Muslim East Bengal in this state, so Bengalis had no part in the name. Another sign of how completely improbable and impractical was the attempt in 1947 to create a viable state out of two pieces 1,000 miles apart. Certainly most of the Punjabis and Pathans who dominate West Pakistan never really thought of the East Bengalis as fellow countrymen, or even true Muslims, shared much British racial contempt for them, and contrasted their alleged passivity with the supposedly virile qualities of the ethnicities dubbed by the British as martial, the Punjabis and Pathans. The official language of Pakistan is native to neither of its old halves. Urdu, related to horde, from the Turkic Persian word for a military camp, started as the military dialect of the Muslim armies of the Indian subcontinent in the Middle Ages, a mixture of local Hindustani with Persian and Turkic words. It was never spoken by Muslims in Bengal, but then it has never been spoken by most of the people of what is now Pakistan either. It was the language of Muslims in the heartland of the old Mughal Empire, centered on the cities of Delhi, Agra, Lucknow, Bhopal and Hyderabad, deep in what is now India. Urdu is the official language of Pakistan, the language of the state education system, of the national newspapers, and of the film industry, but the only people who speak it at home are the Mohajirs, people who migrated from India after partition in 1947, and who make up only 7% of Pakistan's population. However, what is now Pakistan is not nearly such an artificial construct as the old Pakistan of 1947 to 71. It has a geographical unity which in some respects is thousands of years old, being basically the valley of the river Indus plus neighboring mountains, deserts, and swamps. To a much greater extent than most post-colonial states, Pakistan therefore has a core geographical unity and logic. Moreover, most of Pakistan's different ethnicities have lived alongside each other for millennia, have been Muslim for hundreds of years, and have often been ruled by the same Muslim dynasties. Regional identity may be growing in political importance, with the 2008 elections showing a lower vote for the PPP in Punjab, and a lower vote for the Punjab-based Muslim League in other provinces. All the same, with Pakistanis, there is usually a wheel within a wheel, an identity within an identity, which in turn overlaps with another identity. The only exceptions, the people with a single identity, are some of the Islamists, and some of the soldiers, but by no means all of either. Or as Ali Hassan, a young Lahori executive with a Norwegian company, said to me, "If I were to jump on a box and preach revolution, with the best program in the world, you know what would happen? First, people from all the other provinces would say that we can't follow him, he's a Punjabi. Then most of the Punjabis would say, we can't follow him, he's a Jat. Then the Jats would say, we can't follow him, he's from such and such a biradari. Even in my own village, half the people would say something like, I can't follow him, his grandfather beat my uncle in a fight over land. If you preach Islamic revolution, most Pakistanis won't follow you because they practice different kinds of Islam and worship different saints. So you see, we Pakistanis can't unite behind a revolution because we can't unite behind anything." Or, in the saying common in Pakistan as across the greater Middle East, I against my brother, I and my brother against our cousins, and our family against our biradari and our biradari against other biradari. Occasionally they end, and Pakistan against the world, but not often. Not surprisingly then, until recently at least, every attempt to unite large numbers of Pakistanis behind a religious, an ethnic or a political cause ended in the groups concerned being transformed by the ever-present tendency to political kinship, and its incestuous sister, the hunt for state patronage. This wooed them away from radicalism to participation in the Pakistani political system, which revolves around patronage, something that is true under both military and civilian governments in Pakistan. Weak state, strong societies. Indeed, a central theme of this book is that the difference between civilian and military regimes in Pakistan is far less than both Western and Pakistani analysts have suggested. A fundamental political fact about Pakistan is that the state, whoever claims to lead it, is weak, and society in its various forms is immensely strong. Anyone or any group with the slightest power in society uses it among other things to plunder the state for patronage and favors, and to turn to their advantage the workings of the law and the bureaucracy. Hence the astonishing fact that barely 1% of the population pays income tax, and the wealthiest landowners in the country pay no direct taxes at all. As a state auditor in Peshawar said to me with a demoralized giggle, if anyone took taxes seriously, I'd have the most difficult job in the world, but as it is I have the easiest. The weakness of the state goes far beyond a dependence on patronage for the survival of governments. To an extent most Westerners would find hard to grasp, the lack of state services means that much of the time, the state as such, as an agent with its own independent will, does not necessarily affect many people's lives very much, either in terms of benefits or oppressions. The presence of policemen, judges and officials may make it look as if the state is present, but much of the time these people are actually working, and sometimes killing, on their own account, or at the behest of whoever has the most power, influence and money at a certain point, in a certain place. The 19th-century British colonial official Sir Thomas Metcalfe described the traditional villages of northern India as little republics, administering their own justice, deciding their own affairs, and paying only what tribute to the state could be extracted from them by force. This independence has been very greatly reduced over the years, but compared to any Western society a good deal of it still exists in many areas, if not specifically in the village, then in local society generally. Society is strong above all in the form of the kinship networks, which are by far the most important foci of most people's loyalty. For those readers who are really interested and have a few brain cells to lose, a brief description of the horribly complex subject of kinship terms and groups in Pakistan is appended to the end of this introduction. Suffice it to say here that the language of kinship, even among people who are not in fact related, permeates most of Pakistan as it does most of South Asia, whether it is a matter of affection, responsibility, asking for favors or asking for protection. The most wonderful expression of this, which perfectly sums up India's mixture of kinship, democracy and hierarchy, is the term with which you may wish to address a relatively menial person in northern India who happens to be in a position to help or harm you, like a bus conductor by Sahib, or a brother lord. Kinship is central to the weakness of the Pakistani state, but also to its stability, above all because of its relationship with class. Because the Pakistani political elites, especially in the countryside, rely for their strength not just on wealth but on their leadership of clans or kinship networks. Kinship plays a vital part in maintaining the dominance of the feudal elites and many of the urban bosses. By helping to enforce on the elites a certain degree of responsibility for their followers, and circulating patronage downwards, kinship also plays a role in softening, to a limited extent, class domination. Kinship is therefore partially responsible for Pakistan's surprisingly low rating of social inequality according to the Gini coefficient, which I will discuss further in Chapter 6.4. In both these ways, kinship is a critical anti-revolutionary force, whether the revolution is of a socialist or Islamist variety. The importance of kinship is rooted in a sense, which runs along a spectrum from very strong to very weak depending on circumstance and degree of kinship, of collective solidarity for interest and defense. This interest involves not just the pursuit of concrete advantage, but is also inextricably bound up with powerful feelings of collective honor or prestige, and shame, and, indeed, a kinship group which is seen as dishonored will find its interests decline in every other way. A sense of collective honor among kin is thus reflected most dramatically in preventing or punishing any illicit sexual behavior by the kinship group's women, but also in working to advance the political and economic power and public status of the group. This is a cultural system so strong that it can persuade a father to kill a much-loved daughter, not even for having an affair or becoming pregnant, but for marrying outside her kinship group without permission. You don't get stronger than that. As Alison Shaw and others have noted, the immense strength and flexibility of the kinship system in Pakistan, and most of India too, are shown, among other things, by the way in which it has survived more than half a century of transplantation to the very different climes of Britain. Shaw writes, families in Oxford are therefore best seen as outposts of families in Pakistan whose members have been dispersed by labor migration. In Britain, a distinctive pattern of living near close kin has emerged, echoing that of earlier migrations within the Indian subcontinent. Defense of the honor and the interests of the kinship group usually outweighs loyalty to a party, to the state, or to any code of professional ethics, not only for ordinary Pakistanis, but for most politicians and officials. It is important to understand, therefore, that much Pakistani corruption is the result not of a lack of values, as it is usually seen in the West, but of the positive and ancient value of loyalty to family and clan. Since the kinship group is the most important force in society, the power of kinship is inevitably reflected in the political system. Just as in much of the rest of South Asia, a majority of Pakistan's political parties are dynastic. The PPP is the party of the Bhutto family, the PML-N is that of the Sharif family, and the Awami National Party, ANP, in the frontier is the party of the Wali Khan family. The local political groupings which are the building blocks of these parties are themselves based on local dynasties. Hence the phenomenon of a woman such as Benazir Bhutto rising to the top of the political system, in an extremely conservative male-dominated society. This was power by inheritance, and says not much more about ordinary women's rights in modern Pakistani society than the inheritance of the throne by Queens Mary and Elizabeth from their father said about ordinary women's rights in 16th-century English society. The only institution which has succeeded to some extent in resisting this in the name of state loyalty and professional meritocracy is the army, and you could say that it has managed this in part only through turning itself into a kind of giant clan, serving its members' collective interests at the expense of the state and society, and underpinned to some extent by ancient local kinship groups among the northwestern Punjabis and Pathans. If the importance of kinship links has survived transplantation to the cities of Britain, it is not surprising that it has survived migration to the cities of Pakistan, especially because in both cases, the British through marriage with people from home villages in Pakistan, the urban populations are continually being swelled and replenished by new migration from the countryside. The continued importance of kinship is a key reason why Pakistan's tremendous rate of urbanization in recent years has not yet led to radical changes in political culture, except, for reasons I will explain, in Karachi. Largely because of the strength of kinship loyalty, Pakistani society is probably strong enough to prevent any attempt to change it radically through Islamist revolution, which is all to the good, but this is only the other face of something which is not so good, which is society's ability to frustrate even the best designed and best intentioned attempts at reform and positive development. Key factors in this regard are the gentry in the countryside and the intertwined clans of business, political and criminal bosses in the towns, all of them maintaining continuity over the years through intermarriage. Often within the extended family, almost always, except among the highest elites, within the wider kinship group. Marriage with members of the same kinship group, and when possible of the same extended family, is explicitly intended to maintain the strength, solidarity and reliability of these groups against dilution by outsiders. Shaw writes of the Pakistanis of Oxford that in the year 2000, almost 50 years after they first started arriving in Britain, there had been barely any increase in the proportion of marriages with non-kin, and that over the previous 15 years 59% of marriages had been with first cousins, and the proportion in strongly Pakistani cities such as Bradford is even higher. Greater wealth was perceived not solely in terms of individual social mobility, although it provides opportunities for this, but in terms of raising the status of a group of kin in relation to their wider biradari and neighbors in Pakistan. Status derives not only from wealth, mainly in terms of property and business, but also from respectability, primarily expressed by an ashraf, noble, lifestyle. One element of being considered a man worthy of respect derives from having a reputation as being someone who honors his obligations to kin. Cousin marriage is one of the most important expressions of this obligation. The majority of East Oxford families have not achieved social mobility and status through massive accumulation of property and business. For them, the marriages of their children to the children of siblings in Pakistan is an important symbol of honor and respectability, a public statement that even families separated by continents recognize their mutual obligations. It is above all thanks to locally dominant kinship groups that over the years, beneath the froth and spray of Pakistani politics, the underlying currents of Pakistani political life have until recently been so remarkably stable. Civilian governments have come and gone with bewildering rapidity, whether overthrown by military coups or stranded by the constantly shifting allegiances of their political supporters. Yet the same people have gone on running these parties, and leading the same people or kinds of people at local level. The same has been true under military governments. None of these changes of government or regime has produced any real change to the deeper structures of Pakistani politics, because these are rooted in groups and allegiances which so far have changed with glacial slowness. Feudals. In the countryside, and to a great extent in the towns as well, the most powerful elements are not individuals, though they are led by individuals, or even families in the Western sense. From this point of view, as from many others, the description of the rural landowners as feudals is false, in so far as it suggests any close comparison with their medieval European equivalents. If this were so, the Pakistani feudals would long since have been swept away by pressure from below and reform from above. Each individual feudal is quite a small landowner by traditional European standards. 500 acres is a big estate in Pakistan, and most of his, or sometimes her, wealth may well now come from urban property. In Punjab at least, the really big landowners lost most of their land in the land reforms of Ayub in the late 1950s and Bhutto in the early 1970s. In fact, I thought of arguing that there is in fact no such thing as a feudal in Pakistan, but then I remembered wild boar hunting with the noble landowners of Sindh, a remarkably feudal experience, described in Chapter 8. So what I'll say instead is that while there certainly are feudals in Pakistan in the loose Pakistani sense of that term, there are no feudals in the European historical sense. A great many leading feudal families, especially in northern Punjab, are not old landowning families at all, but emerged quite recently, often on the basis of urban property or successful corruption when in state service. However, they adopt the same manners and behave politically in the same ways as the old families. Above all, they appeal for support in their own kinship groups, and do so on the basis of the same old politics of patronage and protection. Indeed, the most powerful remaining feudals in Pakistan owe their power not to the extent of their personal landholdings but to the fact that they are the chiefs of large tribes, and the importance of leadership roles in kinship groups extends down to the lesser gentry as well. It is the way in which individual landowners are embedded in landowning clans, like the Gujars of Attock, the subject of a classic study by Stephen Lyon, which gives them their tremendous strength and resilience, and allows them to go on controlling the politics of the countryside, and dominating those of the country as a whole. 7. If the political power of the kinship group in Pakistan depended only on the distribution of patronage, then this power might well have declined over time, given that patronage will always be limited, but it is also rooted in the oldest of social compulsions, collective defense. As one landowner politician in Sindh told me, in words which were echoed by many other people and provide the title for this book. This is a hard country. You need family or tribal links to protect you, so that there are people who will stick with you and sacrifice for you whatever happens. That way you will not be abandoned even when out of government. The tribal people gives even ordinary tribesmen some strength and protection against attack, whether by dacoits, the police, the courts. Your tribesmen will get you out of jail, lie for you to the court, avenge you if necessary. Since British days, outside the Baloch and Pathan areas, this has rarely been a matter of the whole clan taking up arms against a rival clan. Rather, in a violent society in which none of the institutions of the state can be relied on to act in accordance with their formal rules, close relations with kinsfolk are essential for help against rivals, against the predatory and violent police, in the courts, in politics, and in the extraction of political patronage, all areas of activity which overlap and depend on each other. A combination of the weakness of the state and the power of kinship is one critical reason why urbanization has had a much smaller impact on political patterns and structures than one might otherwise have expected. Rather than a new urban population emerging, what we have mainly seen so far is huge numbers of peasants going to live in the cities while remaining culturally peasants. They remain deeply attached to their kinship groups, and they still need their kinship groups to help them for many of the same reasons they needed them in the countryside. Underlying all this is the fact that so much of the urban population remains semi-employed or informally employed, rather than moving into modern sectors of the economy, because these usually do not exist. And of course, while the power of kinship is necessary to defend against the predatory state, it is also one of the key factors in making the state predatory, as kinship groups use the state to achieve their goals of power, wealth, and triumph over other kinship groups. As one informed description of the state legal system has it, below the level of the high courts all is corruption. Neither the facts nor the law in the case have real bearing on the outcome. It all depends on who you know, who has influence, and where you put your money. So the ancient Pakistani kinship groups and the modern Pakistani state dance along together down the years, trapped in a marriage that ought to be antagonistic, but has in fact become essential to the nature of each party. The problem about all this is that while in one way the power of kinship, underpinning the rule of the elites, has so far maintained the basic stability and even the existence of Pakistan, in other ways the plundering of state resources for patronage which this politics breeds has been extremely bad for the development of the country. It is striking that the most economically and socially dynamic sections of the Pakistani population are those which have to a greater or lesser extent been shaken loose from their traditional cultural patterns and kinship allegiances by mass migration. This is most obviously true of the Mohajirs of Karachi, who emigrated from India after 1947. But even more important are the Punjabis who fled from East Punjab in the dreadful summer of 1947, and now form the backbone of the Punjabi economy. A much smaller, but in some ways even more striking, group are the Hazaras of Balochistan who fled from Afghanistan in the late 19th century, and whose educated middle-class society forms a remarkable contrast to the stagnation that surrounds them. How Pakistan Works. The original title for this book was How Pakistan Works, and one of its core goals is to show that, contrary to much instinctive belief in the West, it has actually worked according to its own imperfect but functional patterns. One of the minor curses of writing on world affairs over the past few years has been the proliferating use of the term failed state. Coined originally for genuinely failed and failing states in sub-Saharan Africa, this term has since been thrown around with wild abandon to describe a great range of states around the world, pretty much in accordance with the writer's prejudices or the need of his or her publication for a sensational headline. In this respect, it is instructive to place Pakistan in the context of the rest of South Asia. All of the states of this region have faced insurgencies over the past generation, which in two cases, Afghanistan and Nepal, have actually overthrown the existing state. Sri Lanka and Burma have both faced rebellions which have lasted longer, covered proportionally far more territory, and caused proportionally far more casualties than has been the case with the Taliban revolt in Pakistan. India, the great power of the region, is a stable democracy compared to its neighbors, yet India too has faced repeated rebellions in different parts of its territory, some of them lasting for generations. One of these, the Naxalite Maoist insurgency, affects a third of India's districts, and effectively controls huge areas of the Indian countryside, a far greater proportion of India than the proportion of Pakistan ever controlled by the Pakistani Taliban. The Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, in September 2009 described this insurgency as the biggest threat facing India, and said that to date India had been losing the struggle. A recent book by an Indian journalist describes the greater part of the countryside in several Indian states as effectively ungoverned. This is not to argue that India is in any danger of breaking up or collapsing. Rather, one should recognize that states in South Asia have not traditionally exercised direct control over much or even most of their territory, and have always faced continual armed resistance somewhere or other. As in medieval Europe, for most of South Asian history government was mostly indirect, and implemented not by state officials but through local barons or tribal chieftains, who often revolted against the king, emperor or sultan if they felt that he was not treating them with sufficient respect and generosity. The world of the Pakistani landowners of today would in some ways have been immediately recognizable to their 15th century English equivalents. The British introduced a modern state system which all the present countries of the region have inherited. Yet British rule too was to a great extent indirect. 2/5 of the territory of British India was in fact ruled by autonomous princes who owed allegiance to the King Emperor, or Queen Empress, but governed their own states under British tutelage. Even in the areas which came directly under the British Raj, British rule could not have long maintained itself without the constant help of the local landed aristocrats and chieftains, who in consequence often had pretty much of a free hand when it came to their treatment of their own tenants and laborers. As in parts of Pakistan and India today, these local princelings also sheltered and sponsored bandit groups, dacoits, to help in their constant feuds with their neighbors. When compared to Canada or France, Pakistan inevitably fails. When compared to India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal and Sri Lanka, things therefore do not look so terrible. In fact, a good many key features of Pakistan are common to the subcontinent as a whole, from parties led by hereditary dynasties through the savagery of the police and the corruption of officialdom to the everyday violence and latent anarchy of parts of the countryside. Pakistan is in fact a great deal more like India, or India like Pakistan, than either country would wish to admit. If Pakistan were an Indian state, then in terms of development, order and per capita income it would find itself somewhere in the middle, considerably below Karnataka but considerably above Bihar. Or to put it another way, if India was only the cow belt of Hindi-speaking North India, it probably wouldn't be a democracy or a growing economic power either, but some form of impoverished Hindu nationalist dictatorship, driven by local conflicts. In order to understand how Pakistan works, it is necessary to draw heavily on the field of anthropology. For one of the things that has thoroughly befuddled not just much Western reporting and analysis of Pakistan, but the accounts of Pakistanis themselves, is that very few of the words we commonly use in describing the Pakistani state and political system mean quite what we think they mean, and often they mean something quite different. This is true whether one speaks of democracy, the law, the judicial system, the police, elections, political parties, or even human rights. In fact, one reason why the army is by far the strongest institution in Pakistan is that it is the only one in which its real internal content, behavior, rules and culture match more or less its official, outward form. Or, to put it another way, it is the only Pakistani institution which actually works as it is officially meant to, which means that it repeatedly does something that it is not meant to, which is seize power from its weaker and more confused sister institutions. Parts of Pakistan have been the subject of one of the most distinguished bodies of anthropological literature in the entire discipline, yet with the partial exception of works on the Pathans, almost none of this has made its way into the Western discussion of political and security issues in Pakistan today, let alone the Western media. Critically important works like those of Muhammad Azam Chaudhry and Stephen Lyon on Punjab are known only to fellow anthropologists. Incidentally, this is why in this book I have chosen to describe as Pathans the ethnicity known to themselves, according to dialect, as Pashtuns or Pakhtuns. It was under the name of Pathans, the Hindustani name for them, adopted by the British, that this people is described and analyzed in the great historical and anthropological works of Olaf Caro, Frederick Barth, Akbar S. Ahmed and others, and it was also by this name that this people was known for more than a century to their British military adversaries. The name Pathan recalls this great scholarly tradition as well as the glorious military history of resistance to British conquest, both of which are crucial to understanding developments among the Pathans of the present age. When it comes to other parts of Pakistani society, the lack of detailed sociological research means that analysts are groping in the dark and drawing conclusions largely based on anecdotal evidence or their own prejudices. It is striking and depressing that more than 8 years after September 11th, by far the best U.S. expert on the vitally important subject of Islamist politics in the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, is a young graduate student, Joshua White, one key reason being that he has actually lived in the NWFP. This lack of basic knowledge applies, for example, to the critical area of urbanization and its effects, or lack of them, on religious, cultural, and political patterns. According to standard theories concerning urbanization in the Muslim world, the colossal movement of Pakistanis to the cities over the past generations should have led to fundamental cultural changes, reducing the power of the old political clans and traditional forms of Islam, and strengthening modern and radical forms of Islam and modern mass parties. But is this really happening? My own impressions would tend to suggest that things are much more complicated, for reasons that will be discussed in this book. But they are only impressions. Systematic studies of these questions have not been carried out for almost a generation. As a result of this lack of basic information, too often in Western analysis, when local forms differ from the supposed Western norm, they are not examined, but are treated as temporary aberrations, diseases to be cured or tumors to be cut out of the otherwise healthy patient's system. In fact, these diseases are the system, and can only be cured by a revolutionary change in the system. The only forces in Pakistan that are offering such a change are the radical Islamists, and their cure would almost certainly finish the patient off altogether. Failing this, if Pakistan is to follow Western models of progress, it will have to do so slowly, incrementally, and above all organically, in accordance with its own nature and not Western precepts. The negotiated state. In the course of Pakistan's 60-year history, there have been several different attempts radically to change Pakistan, by 1 civilian and 3 military regimes. Generals Ayub Khan and Pervez Musharraf, military rulers in 1958, 69 and 1999 to 2008 respectively, both took as their model Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the great secular modernizing nationalist and founder of the Turkish Republic. General Zia-ul-Haq, military ruler from 1977 to 1988, took a very different course, trying to unite and develop Pakistan through enforced adherence to a stricter and more puritanical form of Islam, mixed with Pakistani nationalism. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, founder of the Pakistani People's Party and civilian ruler of Pakistan in the 1970s, for his part tried to rally the Pakistani masses behind him with a program of anti-elitist economic populism, also mixed with Pakistani nationalism. And they all failed. Every single one of them found their regimes ingested by the elites they had hoped to displace, and engaged in the same patronage politics as the regimes that they had overthrown. None was able to found a new mass party staffed by professional politicians and ideologically committed activists, rather than local feudals and urban bosses and their followers. Indeed, with the exception of Bhutto, none tried seriously to do so, and after a short while Bhutto's PPP too had ceased to be the radical party of its early years, and had become dependent on the same old local clans and local patronage. The military governments which took power promising to sweep away the political elites and their corruption, also found themselves governing through them, partly because no military regime has been strong enough to govern for long without parliament, and parliament is drawn from the same old political elites, and reflects the society which the military regimes wish in principle to change. Western demands that such regimes simultaneously reform the country and restore democracy, are therefore in some ways an exercise in comprehensively missing the point. To have changed all this, and created a radical national movement for change like that of Ataturk, would have required two things. Firstly, a strong Pakistani nationalism akin to modern Turkish nationalism, something that ethnically divided Pakistan does not have and cannot create, and, secondly, a capacity for ruthlessness to equal that of Ataturk and his followers in suppressing ethnic, tribal, and religious opposition. For the pleasant Western story of Turkey's ascent to its fragile democracy of today ignores both the length of time this took, and the hecatomb of corpses on which the modern Turkish state was originally built. With the exception of the dreadful atrocities perpetrated in East Bengal in 1971, committed against people whom the Punjabi and Pathan soldiery regarded as alien, inferior, and Hindu-influenced, the Pakistani state has not been able to commit abuses on a really massive scale against its own people, either because, in the case of Punjab and the NWFP, its soldiers were not willing to kill their own people, or, in Sindh and even Balochistan, because it always in the end had to make compromises with the local elites. One of the most striking things about Pakistan's military dictatorships is in fact how mild they have been by the historical standards of such dictatorships, when it comes to suppressing dissent and criticism among the elites. Only one prime minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and a tiny handful of politicians have ever been executed in Pakistan, far fewer than have been killed in feuds with each other. Few senior politicians have been tortured. Of course, the poor are a different matter, but, as noted, they get beaten up by the police whoever is in power. Perhaps the single most important social distinction in Pakistan is that between what Graham Greene called the torturable classes and the untorturable ones. 13 This view has support from a surprising source. As General Musharraf writes in his memoirs, whatever the law, civil or military, the poor are always the victims of oppression. Nor indeed has the Pakistani state ever faced rebellion in West Pakistan on a scale that would have provoked massacre in response, though that could be changed by the Taliban insurgency in the Pathan areas, which began in 2004 and gathered strength in 2008 and 2009. India has faced much more serious rebellions, and has engaged in much larger-scale repression in response. But in India, as in Pakistan, the state is not responsible for most human rights abuses. This is something that human rights groups in particular find hard to grasp, since they stem from a modern Western experience in which oppression came chiefly from over-mighty states. In Pakistan, however, as in India, the vast majority of human rights abuses come not from state strength, but from state weakness. Even when they are committed by state policemen, they are not on the orders of the government, but are the result of individual policemen or groups of police preying on the population as their ancestors did for centuries. Take the police chief in the interior of Sindh, who told me, "I try to stop my boys raping women and torturing people to death." Beyond that, you have to be realistic. Anyway, we need to raise more money from the people just to do our job halfway properly. No one can seriously imagine that when police rape a woman or torture a suspected criminal in their custody, that this is the will of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh of India or President Zardari of Pakistan. They can be accused of not doing enough to stop such abuses, but their ability to do so is very limited. So Pakistan, and indeed South Asia and much of Latin America, demonstrates the frequent irrelevance of democracy even in an area where we instinctively think that it makes all the difference, namely human rights. The overwhelming majority of human rights abuses in Pakistan stem from a mixture of freelance brutality and exploitation by policemen, working either for themselves or for local elites, actions by local landlords and bosses, and punishments by local communities of real or perceived infringements of their moral code. The murder of women in honor killings, the giving of young girls in marriage as compensation in the settlement of clan feuds, the dreadful cases of gang rape as a punishment which have taken place in recent years in southern Punjab, Sindh and Balochistan are the work of families, or local clans and their collective leaderships, not of the state. Atrocities by local dominant clans and the police are also entirely characteristic of much of neighboring democratic India. As regards the police, this is starkly revealed in a report by Human Rights Watch of August 2009. Not for nothing was an old Hindustani popular term for banditry, Padshahi Kam, the imperial trade. This indicated not only that ordinary people could usually see no difference between bandits and soldiers, but that they often changed places. Unpaid soldiers became bandits, successful bandits became soldiers of conquering armies, and their leaders became kings. According to standard Western models, and to the Pakistani constitution that derives from them, authority stems from the sovereign people through elections, and then spreads downwards from the government through hierarchical structures, which transmit orders from above, from superior to inferior officials, in accordance with laws made by parliament or at least by some formal authority. In Pakistan, only the armed forces work even in the second half of this way. For the rest of the state, the law, the judiciary and the police, authority is a matter of constant negotiation, with violence or the threat of it very often one of the cards that can be played on either side. The negotiated nature of the Pakistani state was summed up for me in a grim anecdote from a retired general, who in the 1990s was responsible for commanding anti-dacoit operations in Sindh. A subordinate had run a dacoit gang to earth on the estate of a parliamentarian from the then ruling party, and wanted to send troops in to get them, which would have led to furious protests from the governments in Islamabad and Karachi, and most probably the immediate release of the men arrested. His commander overruled him, and instead invited himself to lunch with the landowner concerned. At the end of a convivial meal, he passed his host a note and said that he'd be personally obliged for his help. The next day, 4 of the dacoits were handed over to the army with a message from the landowner politician saying that the general could shoot 2 of them, but could he please charge the other 2 before the courts? "Any 2?" I asked, somewhat faintly. "No," he said, "which 2 we could shoot." Probably they had offended him in some way, or they were not from his tribe. As to the other 2, he knew perfectly well that his influence meant that the courts would never convict them, and they would be released after a few months. The courts are useless when it comes to criminals in this country. If the criminals have any connections, they are bribed, or scared, or both. That is why, if you really want to deal with a miscreant, the only way is to kill him out of hand. This is a hard country, and this is the way things are here, sadly. This negotiated nature of the state also applies to the workings of democracy. For democracy is representative not only of the people, but of all those classes, groups and institutions through which the popular will is refracted until it eventually finds some kind of distorted reflection in elected institutions. In other words, democracy usually reflects not so much the people or the electorate as the distribution of social, economic, cultural and political power within a given society. The nature of Pakistani society, and the weakness of real democratic development, are shown among other things by the lack of real, modern, mass political parties, with their own cadres of party workers. A while spent pondering on these themes should bring out why so much Western analysis of Pakistan misses the mark, because it expects institutions with names like the law and the police to work as they are meant to work in the West, according to rules rather than negotiation. Similarly, Western language about corruption in Pakistan suggests that it can and should be cut out of the political system, but insofar as the political system runs on patronage and kinship, and corruption is intertwined with patronage and kinship, to cut it out would mean gutting Pakistan's society like a fish. This, of course, is precisely what the Islamist revolutionaries would like to do. The modern Islamist political groups are trying to replace the clan and patronage politics of the feudal landowners and urban bosses with their own version of modern mass politics, so far with only very limited success. With the partial exception of the Jamaat Islami, the Islamist political parties have themselves been swallowed up by the patronage system. As for the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, they are so far a primitive collection of guerrilla and terrorist groups, which would be completely at sea if they found themselves responsible for Peshawar, let alone Lahore or Karachi. Of course, they do draw a great deal of their strength from the glaring inequities and oppressions of the Pakistani system, and above all the justice system. It is true, as I have said, that ordinary Pakistanis are themselves part of endless conspiracies to pervert the course of justice, but it is also true that they feel they have no choice, given the nature of the justice system. The state's law is felt by many ordinary people not just to be rigged in favor of the rich, and hopelessly slow, corrupt and inefficient, but also to be alien to local tradition, alien to Islam, the creation of alien Christian rulers, and conducted by the elites for their own benefit. So, as this book will describe, when ordinary people speak of their reverence for the Sharia, and their respect for the Taliban when they introduce the Sharia. This should not necessarily be taken as active support for the Taliban's complete program. Rather, it is a mixture of a reverence for the Sharia as part of the Word of God, dictated to the last prophet, with a vague yearning for a justice system that might be cruder than that of the state, but would also be quicker, less biased in favor of the elites, and conducted before the eyes of the people, in their own language. Mixed in with this is a great deal of somewhat veiled anti-elitist feeling, which in the eyes of parts of the Pathan tribal populations helps fuel mass acceptance of Taliban attacks on the local Maliks and Khans, or tribal bosses and local landowners. But then, the Pathans have always been the most culturally egalitarian people of Pakistan. Among the masses elsewhere, the progress of the Islamists has so far generally been very limited when it comes to gaining active mass support. One key reason for their failure to date is the deeply conservative nature of much of Pakistani society, for, quite contrary to most Western perceptions, Islamist mobilization often thrives not on backwardness, but on partially achieved modernity. Thus, to judge by all the economic evidence about poverty and land ownership, radical Islamist groups preaching land reform ought to be flourishing in the Pakistani countryside. In fact, the only areas where they have had any significant success, outside the Pathan territories, are where a sectarian, Sunni versus Shia, or tribal element comes into play. This is partly because of clan solidarity, but also for the simple reason that the only people who could lead such a radical Islamist movement in the countryside are the local mullahs, and they are in effect chosen by the local feudal landowners, who do not exactly favor radicalism of any kind, least of all involving land reform. In the cities, things are freer, but even their most attempts at political mobilization from below are stifled by the grip of the political bosses and the kinship groups they lead, as well as by the politically apathetic condition of society, and by divisions along religious lines. In other words, while there is certainly a great deal of economic, social discontent in the Pakistani population, being discontented is not at all the same thing as being able to do something about it. As of 2009, the perennial discontent of the urban masses in most of Pakistan continues to express itself not in terms of political mobilization behind new mass movements, but sporadic and pointless riots and destruction of property, including most notably the buses in which the rioters themselves have to travel every day. According to the standard Western version, by which the Western way is the only way to modernity, the key ideological struggle in Pakistan is between Westernized modernity, including democracy, the rule of law, and so on, and Islamic conservatism. A more accurate way of looking at it would be to see much of Pakistan as a highly conservative, archaic, even sometimes quite inert and somnolent mass of different societies, with two modernizing impulses fighting to wake it up. The Western modernizers have on their side the prestige and success of the Western model in the world in general, and the legacy of British rule, including a vague belief in democracy, but are crippled both by the conservative nature of Pakistani society and by growing popular hatred for the U.S. and its Western allies. The Islamist modernizers can draw on a much more ancient and deeply rooted tradition, that of Islam, but are crippled by the conservative nature of Pakistani society, by Pakistan's extreme vociferousness, by the failure of their program elsewhere in the Muslim world, and by the fact that the vast majority of the Pakistani elites reject their model, for cultural as well as class reasons. Both Westernizers and Islamists see the battle between them as apocalyptic, and ending with the triumph of good or evil. Yet there is a fair chance that Pakistan will in effect shrug both of them off, roll over, and go back to sleep. A gamble on the Indus. Pakistan cannot, however, afford to do so, because time is not on Pakistan's side. In the long run, the most important thing about the people of Pakistan is not who they are or what kind of religion they follow, but that whoever they are, there are too many of them for the land in which they find themselves, and more of them all the time. In 2010, the population was estimated at between 180 and 200 million, making Pakistan the sixth largest country on Earth in terms of population. It had risen from 131 million at the census of 1998, 34 million at the census of 1951, 4 years after independence, and only 19 million at the British census of 1911, and is today 10 times what it was 100 years ago. Officially, population growth now stands at 2.2% a year, which would seem to be a serious underestimate. Pakistan's inability to bring this rate down more quickly reflects state weakness, social conservatism, lack of education, above all among women, and the ability of the religious parties to play on popular prejudices. Since Ayub Khan in the late 1950s, no Pakistani government has dared to promote family planning seriously, and the reduction that has occurred has happened because of socio-economic change and urbanization, not through state action. The huge youth bulge making its way through the Pakistani population means that this population will continue to grow steeply for a long time to come. In 2008, 42% of the population was estimated as under the age of 14. If present trends continue, then by the middle of the 21st century, according to World Bank projections, Pakistan may have as many as 335 million people. 16. This is far too many people for Pakistan's available water resources to support, unless the efficiency of water use can be radically improved. If the old Indian economy used to be described as a gamble on the monsoon, then the entire Pakistani state can be described as a gamble on the Indus, and climate change means that over the next century this may be a gamble against increasingly long odds. The capricious power of water in this area is demonstrated by the remains of numerous cities, starting with a gamble on the Indus. Pakistan cannot, however, afford to do so, because time is not on Pakistan's side. In the long run, the most important thing about the people of Pakistan is not who they are or what kind of religion they follow, but that whoever they are, there are too many of them for the land in which they find themselves, and more of them all the time. In 2010, the population was estimated at between 180 and 200 million, making Pakistan the sixth largest country on Earth in terms of population. It had risen from 131 million at the census of 1998, 34 million at the census of 1951, 4 years after independence, and only 19 million at the British census of 1911, and is today 10 times what it was 100 years ago. Officially, population growth now stands at 2.2% a year, which would seem to be a serious underestimate. Pakistan's inability to bring this rate down more quickly reflects state weakness, social conservatism, lack of education, above all among women, and the ability of the religious parties to play on popular prejudices. Since Ayub Khan in the late 1950s, no Pakistani government has dared to promote family planning seriously, and the reduction that has occurred has happened because of socio-economic change and urbanization, not through state action. The huge youth bulge making its way through the Pakistani population means that this population will continue to grow steeply for a long time to come. In 2008, 42% of the population was estimated as under the age of 14. If present trends continue, then by the middle of the 21st century, according to World Bank projections, Pakistan may have as many as 335 million people. 16. This is far too many people for Pakistan's available water resources to support, unless the efficiency of water use can be radically improved. If the old Indian economy used to be described as a gamble on the monsoon, then the entire Pakistani state can be described as a gamble on the Indus, and climate change means that over the next century this may be a gamble against increasingly long odds. The capricious power of water in this area is demonstrated by the remains of numerous cities, starting with those of the Indus Valley civilization 4,000 years ago, that have been either abandoned because rivers have changed their course, or been washed away by floods, as so many towns and villages were by the great floods of 2010. At an average of 240 millimeters of rainfall per year, Pakistan is one of the most naturally arid of the world's heavily populated states. Without the Indus River system and the canals flowing from it, most, even of Punjab, would be semi-desert and scrub forest, called a jungle in Pakistan, as it was before the British began their great irrigation projects. This is apparent if you fly over the country. Once the 5 great rivers of Punjab and the Kabul River flowing from Afghanistan have paid their tribute to the Indus, the vast majority of cultivated land in the southern end of Punjab and the whole of Sindh is only what can be irrigated from the industry. Beyond these lands, all is brown, yellow, and gray, dotted with the occasional oasis provided by natural springs or more often tube wells. Only 24% of Pakistan's land area is cultivated, the great majority through man-made irrigation systems. The rest is pastoral land, or uninhabited, desert, semi-desert, and mountain. Chronic overuse, however, means that many of the natural springs have dried up, and the water table is dropping so rapidly in many areas that the tube wells will also eventually follow them into extinction. That will leave the Indus once again, and in the furor surrounding the debunking of the exaggerated claim that the glaciers feeding the Indus will disappear by 2035, it has been forgotten that they are nonetheless melting, and if they disappear a century or two later, the effects on Pakistan will be equally dire, if no serious action is taken in the meantime radically to improve Pakistan's conservation and efficient use of water. If the floods of 2010 are a harbinger of a long-term pattern of increased monsoon rains, this on the other hand would potentially be of great benefit to Pakistan, but only potentially, because to harness them for agriculture requires both a vastly improved storage and distribution infrastructure, and radical measures to stop deforestation in the mountains and to replant deforested areas. Otherwise, increased rainfall will risk more catastrophes like that of 2010, with the water rushing off the deforested hillsides in the north to swamp first the valleys and then the plains. It should be added, though, that an absolutely essential part of existing infrastructure did work during the floods, the great barrages along the Indus and its tributaries. If these had broken, several of Pakistan's greatest cities would have been inundated, and the death toll would have been vastly higher than the 1,900 who lost their lives. This dependence on the Indus is the greatest source of long-term danger to Pakistan. Over the next century, the possible long-term combination of climate change, acute water shortages, poor water infrastructure and steep population growth has the potential to wreck Pakistan as an organized state and society. Long-term international aid projects in Pakistan should be devoted above all to reducing this mortal threat, by promoting reforestation, repairing irrigation systems and even more importantly improving the efficiency of water use. Human beings can survive for centuries without democracy, and even without much security. They cannot live for more than 3 days without water. The extent of the water crisis that is already occurring will be described in the chapters on Sindh and Balochistan. As two of the authors of the World Bank's very worrying 2004 report on Pakistan's water situation write, the facts are stark. Pakistan is already one of the most water-stressed countries in the world, a situation that is going to degrade into outright water scarcity due to high population growth. There is no feasible intervention which would enable Pakistan to mobilize appreciably more water than it now uses. There are no additional water resources to be exploited, and agricultural water use must decline to enable adequate flows into the degrading Indus River Delta. Pakistan's dependence on a single river system makes its water economy highly risky. Groundwater is now being overexploited in many areas, and its quality is declining. There is little evidence that government, or donors, including the World Bank, have re-engineered their capacity and funding to deal with this great challenge. And here delay is fatal, because the longer it takes to develop such actions, the greater will become the depth, beneath the earth, of the water table. Point 17. According to a 2009 study by the Woodrow Wilson Center drawing on a range of different works, by 2025 population growth is likely to mean that Pakistan's annual water demand rises to 338 billion cubic meters, BCM, while, unless radical action is taken, Pakistan's water availability will be around the same as at present, at 236 BCM. The resulting shortfall of 100 BCM would be two-thirds of the entire present flow of the industry. And this frightening situation would have come about even before the potential effects of climate change begin to kick in. These effects could be to turn stress into catastrophe by the end of the 21st century. Well before Pakistan reaches this point, however, it is likely that conflict over access to the shrinking Indus will have raised tensions between Pakistan's provinces to levels which will be incompatible with the country's survival. If anyone thinks that the condition of Pakistan will be of little consequence to the rest of the world in the long run, they should remember that 100 years from now, if it survives that long, Pakistan will still possess nuclear weapons, one of the biggest armies in the world, one of the biggest populations in the world, and one of the biggest diasporas in the world, especially in Britain. Islamist radicalism, which has already existed for hundreds of years, will also still be present, even if it has been considerably reduced by the West's withdrawal from Afghanistan. All of this will still mean that of all the countries in the world that are acutely threatened by climate change, Pakistan will be one of the most important. Moreover, what happens to Pakistan will have a crucial effect on the rest of South Asia, where around 1/5 of the world's entire population live and will live. Those Indians who would be tempted to rejoice in Pakistan's fall should therefore consider that it would almost certainly drag India down with it. The World Bank has valuable programs in place, on which much more could be built. For example, at present, Pakistan harvests a good deal less of its rainfall than neighboring areas of India, and only a fraction of China's harvest per cubic meter of rainfall. Intensive effort is needed to improve this performance, something which does not require expensive high-tech solutions, but rather a mixture of spadework and better, more innovative management. Concentrating development aid on the improvement of Pakistan's water infrastructure has the added advantage that such improvement is highly labor-intensive and provides a range of jobs, from masses of ordinary workers with spades to highly trained engineers. This means that benefits from international aid will flow immediately to many ordinary people and be immediately apparent to them. By contrast, most U.S. aid in recent decades, though often very useful to the economy as a whole, has not been visible to ordinary people and therefore has had no political effects in terms of attitudes to the U.S. The Pakistani economy. There would be no point in talking about any of this if Pakistan were in fact the hopeless economic and administrative basket case that it is so often made out to be. This is not the situation, however. Pakistan has never followed the Asian tigers in radically successful modern development, and shows no signs of doing so. But for most of the time since 1947 its rates of growth have been substantially higher than India's. Pakistan would be a far more developed and prosperous state today but for the economic disaster of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's nationalization programs of the 1970s, which led to a steep drop in growth. After another period of economic stagnation in the 1990s, worsened by U.S. sanctions imposed as a punishment for Pakistan's nuclear program, under the Musharraf administration from 1999 to 2008 economic growth returned to a rate of between 6.6 and 9% a year, before dropping again as a result of the global economic recession. Certainly, most people in Pakistan are poor, but all the same, as a result of this economic growth, together with the effects of Islamic charity and the circulation of state patronage to the kinfolk and followers of successful politicians, Pakistan lacks the huge concentrations of absolute poverty to be found in India's cities and countryside. In fact, the absolutely poor and defenseless people in Pakistan are often the same as in India, the descendants of the old, untouchable castes, who, seeing nothing for them in India, remained in Pakistan at partition but have never escaped their traditional poverty and marginalization. There are, however, far fewer of them in Pakistan. From this point of view, as so many others, Pakistan has a rather medieval look. The state is very bad at providing modern services such as clean water, medicine, public transport, and education, because it is too weak either to force much of the population to pay taxes or to control corruption on the part of its own officials, in part as a result of the lack of education. Ordinary people are also very bad at organizing themselves to demand or create such services. Certain groups are outside the system altogether, and have no access to protection, patronage, or charity. On the other hand, the system does ensure that the great majority of the population does at least have enough to eat. And where the state decides that a particular development project is of great national importance, it can in fact partially isolate it from the corruption of the rest of the system and ensure that it is built successfully. This was true of the vast extension of dams and irrigation in the 1950s, and in recent years the construction of the port of Gwadar and the fine motorways linking the great cities of northern Pakistan. Pakistan's GDP as of 2009 stood at $167 billion, making it the 48th largest economy in the world, 27th if adjusted for purchasing power. Despite the image of Pakistan as an overwhelmingly rural society, and the dominance of political, social and cultural patterns drawn from the countryside, agriculture as of 2009 accounted for only about 20% of GDP. The service sector accounted for 53%, most of it in informal, very small-scale businesses and transport, with industry at 26%. However, around 60% of the population continued to live in the countryside, helping to explain the continued power of the rural elites. Most of Pakistani industry is made up of textiles and food processing. In 2007, 8 Pakistani exports stood at $18 billion, the majority of them textiles. Pakistan also contains certain islands of high technology, above all the nuclear industry, which, whatever you may think about its strategic implications, is a very remarkable achievement for a country with Pakistan's economic profile, and shows what the Pakistani state can achieve if it really sets its mind to it, and can mobilize enough educated, honest and committed people. It is miserably clear, however, that, as with the other South Asian countries, the greater part of the Pakistani economy has not made the breakthrough to modern development and seems nowhere near doing so. As of 2009, GDP per head stood at a mere $1,250, before adjustment for purchasing parity. Between 1960 and 2005, per capita income as a proportion of that of the USA actually fell from 3.37 to 1.71%. Some 23% of the population live below the poverty line. Underlying this lack of development is a literacy rate which in 2010 stood at only 55.9%, above all because of the complete absence of education for women in much of the countryside. Living in Pakistan. If the West and China want to help improve this picture, they need to develop an approach to Pakistan which recognizes the supreme importance of the country, but is based on a real understanding of it, and not on fantasy, whether of the paranoid or optimistic variety. This book is an attempt to strengthen such understanding. It is based on travels to Pakistan dating back to my time there as a journalist for The Times, London, in the late 1980s, and on 5 research trips in 2007, 9 lasting a total of 6 months, during which I visited all Pakistan's provinces and major cities. It should be said that, with the exception of my stays in some of the Pathan areas, at no point during my visits did I feel under any direct physical threat, except from the execrable local driving, and if you were going to be too affected by that you'd have to avoid visiting about half the world. Moreover, the Pathan areas are only a small proportion of Pakistan as a whole. It is worth stressing this, because one reason why Pakistan is so little known and so badly misinterpreted in the West is that so many analysts and commentators are too afraid to go there, or, if they go, to travel outside Islamabad. This reluctance to visit Pakistan is true even in Britain, which is organically linked to Pakistan by the large Pakistani diaspora, and it is largely unjustified, not to use a stronger word for this behavior. Of course, an unescorted visit to the tribal areas, or a prolonged stay in Peshawar in unprotected accommodation, might very well prove fatal, but it is entirely possible to live for months on end in a dozen other different Pakistani cities, and most of the Pakistani countryside, without in my view running any very serious risk. Researchers, analysts and officials dealing with aid to Pakistan need to do this if they are to do their jobs properly. Point 19. My own recent researches in Pakistan have been not nearly as long as I would have wished, owing to teaching commitments and a short deadline for this book, but they did give me the chance to talk to hundreds of ordinary Pakistanis from every walk of life, most of whom had never been asked for their opinion before by any Pakistani or Western observer or organization. The views of these voiceless masses form the heart of this book, and I have tried to reflect them as faithfully as I can and draw from them an understanding of Pakistani reality. This has not always been easy. I remember a conversation with an elderly leader of the Awami National Party in Peshawar in 2008. In his garden were a pair of strikingly graceful long-legged gray birds with crests. I asked him what they were. "Flamingos," he replied. I don't think so, sir." "No, you are right, of course, they are not flamingos. They migrate to Russia in summer, sensible birds, and then come back here again to lay their eggs. We hoped one of them was female and would lay eggs, but it turns out they are both males. So they fight all the time or stand at opposite ends of the garden sulking. Like Pashtun politicians, sir, perhaps?" With a deep laugh, "Oh yes, yes indeed, unfortunately. But what are they called now in English?" "We call them kunj." Turning to his staff, he asked, "What are kunj in English?" And with absolute, unquestionable conviction, one of them replied. Swans. So if in the course of this book I have sometimes mistaken flamingos for swans, or indeed pristine Pakistani political swans for ugly ducklings, I can only plead in self-defense Pakistani society's ability to generate within an astonishingly short space of time several mutually incompatible versions of a given event or fact, often linked to conspiracy theories which pass through the Baroque to the Rococo. Conflicted Pakistani relations with reality notwithstanding, I am deeply attached to Pakistan, which has provided me with some of the best moments of my life, and Pakistan's people have treated me with immense kindness and hospitality. Pakistan is one of the most fascinating countries of my acquaintance, a place that cries out for the combined talents of a novelist, an anthropologist, and a painter. But after 20 years of intermittently covering Pakistan, this is a clear-sighted affection. I have good friends among the Pakistani elite, but I also take much of what they say with several pinches of salt, even, or especially, when their statements seem to correspond to Western liberal ideology, and please Western journalists and officials. The problem goes deeper than this, however. Western-style democracy has become so associated over the past generation with human rights, wealth, progress, and stability, that to accept that a country cannot at present generate stable and successful forms of it is an admission so grating that both Westerners and educated Pakistanis naturally shy away from it, Westerners because it seems insulting and patronizing, Pakistanis because it seems humiliating. Both, therefore, rather than examining the reality of Pakistan's social, economic, and cultural power structures, have a tendency to reach for simple explanations concerning the wicked behavior of malignant forces, whether the generals, the feudals, the mullahs, or the Americans. Seen from a long historical perspective, things look rather different. Modern democracy is a quite recent Western innovation. In the past, European societies were in many ways close to that of Pakistan today, and indeed, modern Europe has generated far more dreadful atrocities than anything Islam or South Asia has yet achieved. In the future, who can say? The virtues of courage, honor, and hospitality, in which Pakistanis excel, do after all have their permanent worth. It may also be worthwhile in this context to recall the words which the science fiction novelist John Wyndham put into the mouth of a professor asked to give advice on future careers in a world threatened by radical climate change. He had two recommendations: find a hilltop, and fortify it, and enlist in a regiment with a famous name. There'll be a use for you. 21 Pakistan has plenty of famous regiments, and local chieftains have been fortifying hilltops for thousands of years. They may yet cope better with the future than the successful elites of today's world. A note on kinship terms. That kinship is of critical importance in Pakistan is something on which all the academic experts agree, which is nice, because they tend to agree on nothing else about the subject. For me, the definitive word was said 100 years ago by the great British civil servant and ethnographer Sir Denzil Ibbetson. After an official career lasting decades in the Punjab, he wrote, "An old agnostic is said to have summed up his philosophy in the following words: the only thing I know is that I know nothing, and I am not quite sure that I know that." His words express very exactly my own feelings regarding caste in the Punjab. My experience is that it is almost impossible to make any statement whatever regarding any one of the castes we have to deal with, absolutely true though it may be for one part of the province, which shall not presently be contradicted with equal truth as regards the same people in some other district. Point 22. Thus the English term a tribe can be translated into several different local words, which overlap with other English meanings. Qawm can mean tribe, people, ethnicity, or even nation. Zat is related to the Indian word jati, for a subcaste in Hinduism. Tribe can also mean several very different things in different parts of Pakistan. Among the Baloch tribes, not just in Balochistan but in Sindh and southern Punjab as well, a tribe means something like the old clans of Scotland, a tightly knit group under an autocratic chieftain. Among the Pathans, however, while tribal membership is a tremendously important marker of identity and status, the tribes are divided into endless rivalrous sub-tribes, for which new leading men emerge in every generation. Meanwhile in Punjab, the Rajputs, Jats, Gujars and others were presumably tightly knit nomadic tribes in the distant past, but long ago spread out and intermingled territorially across the whole of what is now northern India and Pakistan. The Gujars have given their name to a state in India as well as a city in Pakistan, among many other places. Originally assimilated to the Hindu caste system as Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, thanks to their conquests, many Jats, Gujars and Rajputs later converted to Islam or Sikhism. Within Pakistan, they have no collective overall political identity at all, but have a certain community of sentiment, including a strong sense of superiority to everyone else, and a strong preference for marrying each other. An appeal to fellow Rajput or Jat feeling may gain some limited help when all else fails. More important in terms of loyalty and mobilization is the local subclan, as in Chauhan Rajput, Alpil Rajput, and so on. The Sayyids and Qurayshis are groups peculiar to Islam, being, ostensibly, descendants of the Prophet and his clan, and therefore of Arabic origin. Yet their role and status in South Asian Muslim society has certain limited affinities to that of the Brahmins in South Asian Hindu society. Meanwhile, other kinship groups are descended straight from the lower castes of the Hindu system. These include the Kami artisan and service groups of the towns and villages, and below them, the old untouchables and tribals, who are so far down the system that no one even bothers much if they are Muslim, Hindu or, what most really are, pre-Hindu animist. As in India, these last are the most vulnerable groups in Pakistani society, liable to be preyed on economically and sexually by local dominant lineages and by the police. As to effective political roles within kinship groups and in wider politics, this spreads outwards from the Khandan, denoting both the immediate family and the extended family, often a joint family, in which several brothers and their families live together under one roof, to that hellish concept, invented for the confusion of mankind, biradiri, related to the Indo-European root for brother, which is supposed to denote the descendants of one common male ancestor. To judge by my interviews, however, biradiri can be used to mean almost any kind of wider hereditary kinship link depending on context. In this book, I have therefore used kinship group, or kinship network, rather than biradiri when speaking of such wider groups. Pakistan. A hard country. Anatol Lieven. Part 1, Land, People and History. Chapter 2. The Struggle for Muslim South Asia. Then we made you their successors in the land, to see how you conduct yourselves. The Quran, Surah Yunus 10, verse 14. When we lowered the boat of our existence into the river run with pain, how powerful our arms were, how crimson the blood in our veins. We were sure that after just a few strokes of the oars, our boat would enter its haven. That's not how it happened. Every current was treacherous with unseen maelstroms. We foundered because the boatmen were unskilled, nor had the oars been properly tested. Whatever investigations you conduct, whatever charges you bring, the river is still there, the same boat too. Now you tell us what can be done. You tell us how to manage a Safe landing. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, 23. This chapter is not intended to provide a history of the territory of what is now Pakistan. Something that would take several books. A chronology of the main events of Pakistan's history is, however, included as an appendix to this book. Rather, this chapter will try to draw from the history of the region, and of Islam in South Asia, those events and elements which are of greatest relevance to the situation in which Pakistan finds itself today, notably, the intermittent but recurrent history of Islamist mobilization against Western forces in the region, recurrent attempts by different administrations radically to change Pakistan, and an equally recurrent pattern of governmental failure which is common to both civilian and military regimes, and results from a combination of state weakness and entrenched kinship loyalties, religious allegiances, and local power structures. Islam in danger. As with the Muslim world more widely, the single most important thing to understand about patterns both of Muslim history and of Muslim consciousness in South Asia is the tremendous rise of Muslim power up to the 17th century, and its steep decline thereafter. Before 1947, the glorious history of Muslim rule and cultural achievement in South Asia helped make it impossible for Muslims to accept a subordinate position in what they saw as a future Hindu-dominated India. By the same token, for a long time after independence and to a degree even today, Pakistanis have felt that they not only must compete with India, but must compete on an equal footing, and that to accept anything less would be a humiliating betrayal. This history also contributes to the fact that, in the words of Iqbal Akund, the Pakistani Muslim thinks of himself as heir to the Muslim empire, descended from a race of conquerors and rulers. There is therefore a streak of militarism in Pakistan's ethos, even at the popular level. 24. By 1682, when Ottoman Muslim troops were battering the walls of Vienna, the Mughal Empire ruled, albeit of 10 very loosely, almost the whole of South Asia. The Mughals built on previous Muslim sultanates of Delhi that had ruled most of North India since the 13th century. Even after the Mughal Empire began to fall to pieces in the first half of the 18th century, great Muslim successor dynasties in Awadh, Bengal, Bhopal, Hyderabad and Mysore continued to rule over most of what is now India. While Muslim soldiers conquered, Muslim missionaries converted, but much more slowly. Outside what is now Pakistan, only in Bengal was a majority of the population over a large area converted to Islam. A central tragedy of modern Muslim history in South Asia has been that, as a result, the greatest centers of Muslim civilization in South Asia were established in the midst of Hindu populations, far from the areas of Muslim majority population. The decline of Muslim power, and the partition of 1947, left almost all the greatest Muslim cities, monuments and institutions of South Asia as islands in an Indian Sea, towards which Pakistanis look as if from a distant shore towards a lost Atlantis. The old Muslim dynasties of South Asia were as a rule not severely oppressive towards their Hindu subjects. They could not afford to be, given Hindu numerical predominance and the continued existence of innumerable local Hindu princes. At the popular level, Hindu and Muslim religious practice often merged, just as in Europe Christianity took on many traditions from local pagan religions. At the highest level, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, 1542–1605, founded the Din-i-Ilahi, divine faith, a syncretic cult containing elements of Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity. Nonetheless, in the Muslim kingdoms there was no doubt which religion was foremost in the state, as the great mosques which dominate the old Muslim capitals testify, and were meant to testify. The Din-i-Ilahi cult failed completely to root itself, while, like all attempts to dilute or syncretize Islam, provoking a severe backlash from Orthodox Muslim clerics, which undermined Akbar's authority. The last great Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, 1618–1707, responded to the increasing problems of his empire with a program of strict religious orthodoxy. As elsewhere in the Muslim world, the decline of Muslim power from the early 18th century on produced a complex set of religious and cultural responses, the great majority of which, however, had the same ultimate goal, namely to strengthen the power of Muslims in the face of their enemies, and to strengthen Muslim unity in the face of the Muslims' own divisions. 26 From the later 18th century, Muslim fears were focused above all on the rise of the British. In 1803 the Mughal emperor became a British pensionary. Since those days, religious forms of Muslim resistance to Western power have been a constant in South Asian history, ebbing and flowing but never disappearing. From the mid-19th century on, they have been joined by a very different response, that of Westernization. It is important to note, however, that the great majority of Westernizers have justified their programs in public by arguing that they were necessary in order to strengthen their communities, their countries, or the Muslim world in general against their non-Muslim enemies. In other words, these figures were no more necessarily pro-Western in geopolitical terms than were the Westernizers of Japan. This is something that the West would do well to remember, given our congenital illusion that anyone who shares aspects of our culture must necessarily agree with our foreign policy. The Muslim religious response to Western power has always been a highly complex mixture of conservative and radical elements. Many of these have been reformist, but reformist in the sense of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, not of modern Western reform. They have also shared the fundamentalism of parts of the Protestant tradition, in the sense of a return to the fundamentals of the original religious scriptures. All have stressed the need for Muslims to wage the greater jihad of spiritual struggle and personal and social purification, as well as the lesser jihad of war against Islam's enemies. Underpinning intellectual and political responses by Muslim elites has been a diffuse, but widespread sense among the Muslim masses of Islam in danger. This has contributed to episodes both of mass mobilization and of savage local violence against non-Muslims, or other Muslims portrayed as non-Muslims. These combined in the developments leading to the creation of Pakistan in 1947. This sense of an endangered Islam has long been fueled not only by local or even regional events but by developments in the wider Muslim world. For example, in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the face of attack from Christian powers. The role of the Ummah in the minds of most South Asians therefore might be seen as vaguely analogous to that of Christendom in the European Middle Ages, not something that could ever trump local powers and allegiances and lead to a universal state, but nonetheless a potent idea with important cultural, intellectual, emotional, political and international consequences, not least in the form of the Crusades. With the disappearance of France and Britain as ruling powers in the Muslim world, the focus of Muslim fears concerning Western threats to the wider Muslim world naturally shifted to the new State of Israel, in occupation of Islam's third holiest shrine, as Pakistanis are continually reminded by both their mosques and their media, and Israel's sponsor, the United States. In Pakistan, however, hostility to the U.S. was for a long time damped down by the fact that Pakistan was facing far more pressing dangers, against which the U.S. provided at least a measure of security: India and the Soviet Union. Thus, in the 1980s, President Zia's Islamization program contained no hint of anti-Americanism. for the obvious reason that the U.S. was both an essential ally in fighting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and an essential financial sponsor of Pakistan and Zia's administration. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto made considerable play with anti-American sentiment and with the idea of Pakistan as a leader of the Muslim world, including his rhetoric of a Pakistani Islamic bomb, but his own anti-Americanism owed more to the fashionable left-wing thought of the time. The collapse of left-wing nationalism in the Muslim world in the last quarter of the 20th century has left the Islamists as the last political homeland of anti-American and anti-colonial sentiment. After 1989, a series of developments shattered the previous obstacles to anti-Americanism in Pakistan. First, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union itself removed Pakistan's value to the U.S. as an ally. Instead, free rein was given to groups in Washington that feared Pakistan's nuclear program to press for sanctions on the country. The prominent role of the Israel lobby and pro-Israeli politicians such as Congressman Stephen Salars in these moves helped increase existing anti-Israeli feeling in Pakistan and focus attention on the U.S.-Israel alliance. The anger this caused in Pakistan was exacerbated by the way in which the U.S. abandoned all responsibility for the consequences of a war in Afghanistan which it had done so much to fuel, leaving Pakistan facing a civil war on its borders and a continuing refugee problem. Of even greater importance has been Washington's increasing tilt to India, replacing the mutual hostility that characterized most of the period from 1947 to 1991. Seen from Pakistan, this was reflected first in Washington's willingness to punish Pakistan as well as India for the nuclear race in South Asia, despite the fact that in both 1974 and 1998 it was actually India which first exploded nuclear devices. Moreover, because of its far smaller economy and greater dependence on exports to the West, the U.S. sanctions of the 1990s hit Pakistan much worse than India, and were in fact largely responsible for the economic stagnation of that decade. Since 9/11, the U.S. has sought a quasi-alliance with India, amid much talk in the U.S. of building up India as a force against both China and Islamist extremism. The U.S. has abandoned any pretense at parity in its approach to the Indian and Pakistani nuclear programs, and has sought active nuclear partnership, albeit with qualifications concerning security, with India. The U.S. has put immense pressure on Pakistan concerning sponsorship of militant and terrorist groups in India and Indian-controlled Kashmir, but has repeatedly backed away from any attempt to put pressure on India to reach a settlement of the Kashmir conflict, notably when, in early 2009, pressure from India and the Indian lobby in the U.S. led to India being swiftly dropped from the responsibilities of the Obama administration's regional special envoy, Richard Holbrooke. Also of great importance in creating anti-American feeling in Pakistan has been the belief that Washington has supported authoritarian governments in Pakistan against their own people. In the past, this belief was stimulated by U.S. aid to Generals Ayub, Zia, and Musharraf. Today, it is focused on U.S. help to President Zardari, which just goes to show that U.S. administrations have no preference for military government or indeed any kind of government in Pakistan as long as that government does what the U.S. wants. Pakistanis also tend greatly to exaggerate the degree of hands-on control that the U.S. can exert over Pakistani governments. In fact, the relationship with the U.S. has always been one of mutual exploitation heavily flavored with mutual suspicion. Ayub went to war with India and cultivated relations with China against U.S. wishes. Zia diverted U.S. aid to Pakistan's particular allies among the Afghan Mujahideen, Successive Pakistani administrations developed a nuclear deterrent in the face of strong pressure from Washington, and since 9/11 Pakistani governments have only very partially acceded to U.S. wishes in the War on Terror. However, in Pakistan, facts are rarely allowed to get in the way of a good conspiracy theory, and the widespread belief among Pakistanis is that the U.S. runs their country as a neo-colonial client state. As a conclusive blow to pro-U.S. sentiment in Pakistan came the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. In the immediate wake of 9/11, to judge by my researches in Pakistan in 2001-2, the U.S. move into Afghanistan was accepted with surprisingly little protest by most Pakistanis, and there was some willingness to accept al-Qaeda's responsibility. The invasion of Iraq, however, and the mendacious arguments used by the Bush administration to justify the invasion, appeared to confirm every Muslim fear about the American threat to the Muslim world. The disastrous impact of this invasion in Pakistan is reflected in the fact that it retrospectively destroyed the justification for the Afghan war as well, as far as most Pakistanis are concerned. This shift is reflected in the fact that, to judge by my own interviews and those of other Western colleagues, an absolutely overwhelming majority not just of the Pakistani masses but of the Pakistani elites believe that 9/11 was not in fact carried out by al-Qaeda but was a plot by the Bush administration, Israel, or both, intended to provide a pretext for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan as part of the U.S. strategy of dominating the Muslim world. Whenever a Westerner, or, more rarely, a sensible Pakistani, attempts to argue with this poisonous rubbish, we are immediately countered by the argument that Bush lied over Iraq. So why are you saying he couldn't have lied about 9/11/27, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, coming on top of U.S. support for Israel and growing ties to India, greatly strengthened the vague and inchoate but pervasive feeling among Pakistanis that Islam is in danger at the hands of the U.S. The effects of all this on the desire of Pakistanis to make sacrifices in order to help the U.S. in the War on Terror should hardly need emphasis. Instead, from the widespread hostility to the Afghan Taliban in 2001-2, by 2007-9 the perception of them on the part of the vast majority of ordinary Pakistanis, with whom I spoke at that time, had become close to their view of the Afghan Mujahideen during my time in Pakistan, in the late 1980s, not nice people, or ones they would wish to see ruling Pakistan, but nonetheless brave men waging a legitimate war of resistance, or defensive jihad, against an alien and infidel occupation of their country. Naturally, therefore, there has been intense opposition within Pakistan to the Pakistani military helping the U.S. by attacking the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan's border areas. For a long time, this opposition extended to the Pakistani militants in the region, who were seen as simply attempting to help their Afghan brethren carry on their legitimate struggle. This opposition diminished somewhat as the extent of the militant threat to Pakistan became apparent in 2008-10, and the Pakistani media became much more hostile to the Pakistani Taliban. It remains, however, a very powerful strain of public opinion, and opposition to the military campaign against the Pakistani Taliban, and hostility to the U.S. alliance in general, have done terrible damage to the administrations of both President Musharraf and his successor President Zardari. Religious and secular responses. The specific religious forms that resistance to the West has taken have of course changed considerably over time, while nonetheless preserving an organic continuity. In the 18th and much of the 19th centuries, a prominent part was played by Sufi orders and local religious leaders belonging to those orders, just as in the resistance of the Muslim Caucasians to Russian conquest under Imam Shamil, and that of the Algerians to French conquest under Abdul Qadir. Today, the Wahhabi-influenced Taliban and their like are attacking the shrines of the very saints who formerly fought against the British, French and Russians, but nonetheless they are their heirs as far as anti-Western action is concerned. Shah Waliullah, 1703–62, the most significant intellectual Muslim figure of the era, was an Islamist reformist who preached the use of independent reasoning, ijtihad, but directed towards a return to a purer form of Islam based on the Quran, and towards the strengthening of Muslim states and mobilization for armed jihad to restore Muslim power in South Asia, a jihad which he and his followers, like their successors today, saw as defensive. Jihad against the British was declared and implemented by the great Muslim ruler of Mysore in southern India, Tipu Sultan. Shah Waliullah's teaching inspired both the Deobandi tradition, which in recent years has inspired political Islamism in Pakistan, and more immediately Syed Ahmed Barelvi, 1786–1831, who tried to lead a jihad against growing Sikh rule in the Punjab. Interestingly, he and his 600 followers became the first of a number of figures, of whom Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are the latest, to move from elsewhere to the Pathan tribal areas, both because the absence of government provided what we would now call a safe haven, and because the legendary fighting qualities of the Pathan tribes seemed to make them prime recruits for jihad. Like many of his successors, however, Syed Ahmed Barelvi discovered that the tribes also have their own traditions and their own agendas. He was abandoned by most of his local Pathan allies after he tried to replace the traditions of the Pathan ethnic code of Pashtunwali with strict adherence to the Quran, and, together with his closest disciples, was killed in battle by the Sikhs at Balakot. He is remembered by jihadi Islamists in the region as the greatest progenitor of their tradition, though the precise circumstances of his end tend to be glossed over. Following Shah Waliullah's defeat and death, his grandson Muhammad Ishaq quit India in disgust for Arabia. Because of their radical fundamentalism and Arabian links, Syed Ahmed, his followers and descendants were given a name by the British which also has profound echoes in the present day, that of Wahhabi, after the ferociously puritanical fundamentalist movement founded by Muhammad Abdul Wahhab in Arabia in the late 18th century, and adopted by the House of Saud as their religion. As with the attribution of Wahhabism to the Taliban today, this was only partly accurate. Shah Waliullah had studied in Arabia, in part under teachers who taught Wahhab, but his teaching and that of his descendants differed from Wahhabism in significant respects. However, the Wahhabis' capture and savage purging of Mecca and Medina, including the destruction of heretical shrines and even that of the Prophet himself, had made them a name that was useful for both supporters and opponents of jihad. Supporters because of their reputation for courage and religious rigor, enemies because of their reputation for barbarism and their ferocious attacks on Muslims from other traditions. As in South Asia and the former Soviet Union today, the term Wahhabi, therefore, came to be thrown about with abandon to describe a variety of supporters of jihad and advocates of fundamentalist reform of Islam. All the same, those fighting against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda today would do well to remember that, though new movements in themselves, they have roots going back hundreds of years in Arabia and South Asia, and 180 years among the Pathan tribes. The critical moment in the Muslim response to British rule came with the Great Revolt of 1857, known to the British as the Indian Mutiny. This revolt itself stemmed in part from the British abolition the previous year of Awadh, the last major semi-independent Muslim state in North India. In Lucknow, mutinous soldiers proclaimed the restoration of the Awadh monarchy, and, in Delhi, they made the last Mughal emperor their figurehead. Across much of North India, radical Muslim clerics preached jihad against the British. In consequence, although a great many Hindus took part in the revolt, the British identified Muslims as the principal force behind it, and British repression fell especially heavily on Muslims and Muslim institutions. The two greatest Muslim cities of North India, Delhi and Lucknow, were ferociously sacked and largely destroyed by the British Army and its Punjabi auxiliaries, with many of their leading citizens killed. The last vestiges of the Mughal Empire were wound up, and many Muslims dismissed from the British service. In the decades following the revolt, the Muslim elites, as the former ruling class of much of India, suffered especially from changes introduced by the new British administration which replaced the East India Company. English replaced Persian as the language of administration, and English-language universities increasingly replaced traditional Muslim centers of education. Intentionally or unintentionally, British rule also came to favor the Hindu upper castes above the old Muslim elites. Hindus moved with greater ease into the British educational institutions, and hence came to dominate the lower ranks of the civil service. The growth of Calcutta, Bombay, Madras and Karachi as commercial entrepôts favored the Hindu trading castes. Most disastrously of all, the gradual introduction of representative institutions from the 1880s on revealed just how heavily Muslims were outnumbered by Hindus across most of India. Muslim responses to these challenges continue to shape the Pakistani state and Pakistani public debate of today. Some of the responses centered on secular education and mobilization, some on different forms of religious renewal. Different movements, or the same movements at different times, emphasized competition with Hindus, or cooperation with them against British rule. As for the idea of a separate Muslim state in South Asia, this emerged only at the very end of British rule, and in a very ambiguous form. However, whatever approach they adopted, the vast majority of Muslims who became politically engaged did so in separate organizations from the Hindus. In the early days of the Indian Congress, some of its more radical Hindu leaders opposed Muslim membership. In the very broadest terms, the main tendencies of Muslim response to British colonialism can be divided into three: that stemming from or related to Shah Waliullah and his preaching of religious renewal and resistance, that epitomized by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, 1817–98, and that of the mass of the Muslim population, including the local rural elites. These latter basically got on with their lives and with extracting whatever benefits they could from British rule, notably, in northern Punjab, in the form of military service and settlement in the new canal colonies, while at the same time being subject to occasional waves of unrest when fears as to the safety of their Muslim identity were aroused. Local factors also sometimes produced armed revolts by specific Muslim groups, chiefly in the Pathan areas, but also in the 1920s on the part of the Maplas of the Carnatic in southern India, and in the 1940s on the part of the Hurs, religious followers of the Pir Pagaro, a hereditary saint in Sindh. Sir Syed Ahmed Khan was a Mughal aristocrat who sided with the British in 1857. Though he also bitterly criticized their policies. Although himself a deeply religious man, Sir Syed advocated the need for Indian Muslims to collaborate with the British and to learn the ways of Western modernity in order to develop as a people and compete successfully with the ascendant Hindus. Sir Syed founded what he intended to be the Muslim Cambridge, the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, at Aligarh, another of those key Muslim institutions now left behind in India. In 1888, Sir Syed laid down the basic principle on which Pakistan was created, though without at that stage dreaming of territorial separation. He stated that India is inhabited by two different nations, which would inevitably struggle for power if the British left. Is it possible that under these circumstances two nations, the Mohammedan and the Hindu, could sit on the same throne and remain equal in power? Most certainly not. It is necessary that one of them should conquer the other and thrust it down. To hope that both could remain equal is to desire the impossible and the inconceivable. The founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and his closest associates, therefore stood in the direct tradition of Sir Syed, a tradition which saw the Muslims of the subcontinent as a kind of nationality defined by language, Urdu, and religiously influenced culture, rather than by religion as such. The priority given to fear of the Hindus naturally inclined this tradition to oppose the Hindu-led Indian independence movement, and to ally with the British against it. In Pakistan, this tradition of nationalist modernization has been followed by two of Pakistan's military leaders, Ayub Khan and Pervez Musharraf, and by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Ayub could also be seen to have replaced Britain with America as the Muslims' inevitable, if unfortunate, ally in their struggle with Hindu India. In a vaguer sense, Sir Syed's program of broadly Western modernization remains the ideology of the Pakistani civil service, and of the educated wealthy classes, though their commitment actually to do much about this is another matter. Some members of this tradition decided in 1947 to throw in their lot with India rather than Pakistan, and are now to be found scattered through the worlds of Indian politics, administration, the universities, and especially the arts. Under British rule, the Islamist tradition of Shah Waliullah naturally opposed collaboration with the British and stood for anti-colonial resistance, though, given the realities of British power, this was inevitably mostly by peaceful means. This led to the paradoxical result that some of the most fervent proponents of jihad, like Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, 1888–1958, were also advocates of close cooperation with Hindu Indian nationalists against British rule. Azad ended as an Indian National Congress leader and independent India's first Minister of Education. This tradition therefore opposed the partition of India and the creation of a separate Pakistani state, in part because they were attached to the idea of a universal Muslim Ummah and opposed any move to divide it further, along national lines. It is entirely logical therefore that Pakistan's largest Islamist party, the Jamaat-e-Islami, should have opposed the creation of Pakistan in the name of loyalty to the Ummah, and today should be especially committed to Muslim causes in the wider world, including the jihads in Palestine, Chechnya and Kashmir, also in the name of defending the universal Ummah, rather than narrow Pakistani national interests. President Musharraf, by contrast, explicitly condemned this approach in his speeches after September 11, emphasizing the need for Pakistanis to put Pakistan first. The genesis of Pakistan. The last generation of British rule saw two Muslim mass political movements in South Asia, the Muslim League and the Khilafat movement. The Muslim League, founded in 1906 and heavily influenced by Sir Syed's tradition, began as an elite movement to defend Muslim interests, extract concessions from the British, and either oppose or cooperate with the Indian National Congress as tactical advantage dictated. It only became a true mass movement in the last years of British rule. Though founded in Dhaka, in what is now Bangladesh, by far the strongest support of the Muslim League was in the heartland of Muslim Urdu-speaking culture, in the United Provinces between Delhi and Allahabad, now the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. A key moment in its foundation came in 1900 when the British agreed that Hindi, Hindustani and the Hindu, Devanagari script, should be placed on an equal footing with Urdu, Hindustani and the Muslim Arabic script, as an official language, with the clear implication that given Hindu numerical preponderance, Urdu would eventually be edged out of government altogether. The other great Muslim movement under British rule was much more in the tradition of Shah Waliullah, being both explicitly religious and much more radical. This was the Caliphate movement, from 1919 to 1924, one of whose leaders was Maulana A.K. Azad, mentioned above. This took place in alliance with the Indian National Congress, now led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and was the chief Muslim aspect of the unrest which gripped India after the end of the First World War. However, as its name suggests, the formal catalyst of the movement was a purely Muslim one, and reflected allegiance to no South Asian cause, but to the universal Ummah. South Asian Muslims rallied behind the movement in protest against the impending abolition of the Caliphate, or titular leadership of the Muslim world, which the Ottoman sultans had claimed. The Caliphate issue became the rallying cry for protest against the British and French subjugation of the entire Middle East and destruction of the last Muslim great power, as well as of course against British colonial rule in India, and a range of local Muslim grievances. The Jamaat and other Islamist groups in Pakistan today see their hostility to the U.S. today as directly descended from this Islamist anti-colonial tradition. As Mahatma Gandhi himself wrote in 1922, "The great majority of Hindus and Muslims have joined the anti-British struggle believing it to be religious. The masses have come in because they want to save the Caliphate and the cow. Deprive the Mussulman of the hope of helping the Caliphate, and he will shun the Congress. Tell the Hindu he cannot save the cow if he joins the Congress, and he will, to a man, leave it." The Caliphate movement was led by two clerics, the brothers Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar and Maulana Kakit Ali, and generated a wave of religious enthusiasm among South Asian Muslims. For that reason it was disliked by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who stood in Sir Syed Ahmed's tradition of tactical cooperation with the British, and to whom religious fanaticism was deeply antipathetic. So great was this religious enthusiasm that in 1920 some 20,000 Indian Muslims attempted to emigrate to Afghanistan, as the last independent Muslim state left standing in the region. They were eventually expelled by the Afghan authorities after having been robbed of many of their possessions, not the first or the last time that the hopes of South Asian Islamists concerning the Afghans have been disappointed. The rhetoric of the Caliphate movement was heavily influenced by that of jihad, and the movement's violent edge led to increasing tension with Gandhi and the Congress. The movement finally collapsed in the face of British repression, and the Caliphate was eventually abolished not by the colonial powers but by Kemal Ataturk and the new Turkish Secular Republic. The mass religious enthusiasm which powered the Caliphate movement eventually flowed into the very different strategy of the Muslim League, led in the 1920s by Sir Muhammad Iqbal, 1877 to 1938, and from 1936 by Jinnah. A radically simplified account of League strategy in these years would be that it involved selective cooperation with the Congress, to put pressure on the British to grant more extensive powers of legislation and self-government to India and the Indian provinces, and selective cooperation with the British to limit Congress's power and ensure Muslims a guaranteed share of the new legislatures and governments. The idea of creating a separate state for Muslims in South Asia came only very late. It was first raised by Iqbal in 1930, and he still envisaged that this state would be part of a wider Indian confederation. Shortly afterwards, the name Pakistan was coined for this proposed state. The so-called two-nation theory had in a way been implicit in Muslim League ideology from the beginning. This theory holds that Indian Hindus and Muslims have the characteristics of two different ethnocultural nations. As the example of Lebanon, Northern Ireland, and other countries where what are in effect different nations live in one country under a set of arrangements for coexistence. This does not, however, necessarily dictate territorial separation. The decisive moment for the demand for Pakistan as a slogan came with the Government of India Act of 1935, and the elections of 1937 which followed. Prior to the elections, Congress had made informal promises to the League that the two parties would form coalition governments in provinces with substantial Muslim minorities. As it turned out, however, Congress's victories were so overwhelming that, most unwisely, the Congress leadership decided that it did not need to share government with the League, and reneged on its promise. This Congress treachery convinced Jinnah and the other leaders of the League that Muslim parties would be excluded from power in a Congress-ruled independent India, and Muslims reduced to a wholly subordinated community. In the background to all these moves and counter-moves were recurrent communal riots, in which local issues and religious prejudice led Hindus and Muslims to attack each other, often resulting in heavy casualties. The eventual result was the Lahore Resolution of 1940, in which, at Jinnah's call, the Muslim League set out the demand for an independent Muslim state. However, Jinnah still spoke not of full separation but rather of dividing India into autonomous national states, my italics, and as the distinguished South Asian historian Aisha Jalal has convincingly demonstrated, this demand was not quite what it seemed. As late as 1939, Jinnah was stating that although Hindus and Muslims were separate nations, they both must share the governance of their common homeland. Jinnah in the end was bitterly disappointed with the moth-eaten Pakistan that he eventually received. Not merely did this exclude almost all the great historic Muslim centers of India, but it left out those areas of North India where support for the Muslim League and the demand for Pakistan had been strongest, and yet for demographic and geographical reasons, there was no way that an independent Pakistan could ever have included these areas. Furthermore, all the evidence suggests that Jinnah and the League leadership were completely unprepared for the realities of complete separation from India. This was to have tragic consequences when Pakistan was created. Rather, it seems, Jinnah was using the slogan of Pakistan for two purposes: to consolidate his own control over the League, and as a threat to force Congress to concede what he, and most Muslims, really wanted. This was a united India in which Muslims would be guaranteed a share of power, which in turn would guarantee their rights. On the one hand, this would be a highly decentralized India in which the provinces, including the Muslim-majority provinces, would hold most of the power, a goal shared by the Muslim and indeed Hindu elites of Punjab and Sindh. On the other hand, Muslims would be constitutionally guaranteed a 50% share of positions in the central government, and a large enough share of the central legislature to block any attempts to change the constitution or introduce policies hostile to Muslim interests. In 2010, such goals may not seem particularly outrageous. In the cases of Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Lebanon and parts of Africa, we have become accustomed in recent decades to constitutional arrangements guaranteeing power sharing between different ethno-religious groups, and heavily qualifying strict majoritarian democracy. However, these demands proved unacceptable to the Congress. They threatened Congress's power, Hindu jobs, and the plans of Congress leader Jawaharlal Nehru for state-led economic development, something which depended on a strong centralized state. There was also a well-based fear that a loose Indian confederation would soon collapse into appalling civil war. In the end, therefore, Congress preferred, however unwillingly, a smaller but strong and united Congress-dominated India to a larger but weak, decentralized and endangered Indian confederation. In 1947, with British rule disintegrating and Hindu-Muslim violence increasing, the British agreed with Congress and the League on Independence and Partition. Pakistan was to consist of two halves separated by almost 1,000 miles of Indian territory. In the east, the Muslim-majority areas of the province of Bengal; in the west, the Muslim-majority areas of the province of Punjab, together with Sindh, the northwest frontier province and adjoining tribal and princely territories. To some extent, the movement for Pakistan may have escaped from Jinnah's hands. As his famous speech to the Pakistani Constituent Assembly had it, in Pakistan, Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of every individual, but in the political sense as citizens of the state. This passage makes clear that Jinnah expected Pakistan to be a Muslim majority but essentially secular country, in which Muslims would be the people of state, but large Hindu and Sikh minorities would exist and would have a share of power. Pakistan would also therefore still be part of a wider South Asian unity, in cultural, social and economic terms, with the possibility of some form of confederation between equal partners emerging later. However, since Muslim numerical weakness meant that Jinnah and the League could not block Congress's plans by democratic and constitutional means, they were critically dependent on Muslim street power, and this street power was largely mobilized using the rhetoric of Islam, with strong jihadi overtones harking back to the Khilafat movement, and of communal fear. This then collided head-on with Hindu and especially Sikh street power mobilized in the name of their respective fears and visions. Jinnah spoke of a secular Pakistan, but on the streets the cry was the Muslim profession of faith. Pakistan ka nara kiya? La ilaha illallah. What is the slogan of Pakistan? There is no God but God. This is still the slogan of the Islamist parties in Pakistan concerning the country's identity. The wave of mass religious enthusiasm that powered the Muslim League in the last years before partition led Peter Hardy to describe it as a chiliastic movement rather than a pragmatic political party. The Pakistan movement therefore was one in which a secular-minded leadership in the tradition of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan coexisted uneasily with mass support motivated above all by the cry of Islam in danger, and by vague dreams of creating a model Islamic society. A combination of this religious fervor with Jinnah's original plan to balance against the Hindus in an Indian confederation was responsible for the most disastrous aspect of the new Pakistan, namely the uniting of West Pakistan, the present Pakistan, with Muslim East Bengal. This union made absolutely no geographical, historical, economic or strategic sense, and was bound to collapse sooner or later. Apart from anything else, East Pakistan was indefensible in the face of serious Indian attack, as the War of 1971 proved. The union of West and East Pakistan was dictated in the first instance by the need to keep all Muslims together, so as to form the largest possible bloc against the Hindus within an Indian confederation. Thereafter, the quite different idea of independent Pakistan as the homeland of all the Muslims of South Asia, and the source of their safety and progress, meant that enormous political and emotional capital was invested in trying to maintain Pakistan as one state, when two friendly allied states would have made so much more sense. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s the need to balance, conciliate or suppress the Bengalis of East Pakistan exerted a malign influence on Pakistan's development. The first protests in the East were in defense of the Bengali language, and in opposition to the extension of Urdu as the state language. From there, opposition turned into demands for greater autonomy, and finally into a program of de facto separation. The fact that East Pakistan, though much smaller geographically and economically, held a small majority of Pakistan's population helped make democracy impossible, as it would have implied a Bengali domination which most of the West Pakistanis simply would not accept. This contributed to the breakdown of Pakistani democracy in the 1950s, and the military coup by General Ayub Khan in 1958. Ayub then tried to prevent Bengali domination by abolishing the provinces of West Pakistan and lumping them together in one unit, alongside the other unit of East Pakistan. This in turn greatly increased local discontent in West Pakistan. Ayub's successor, General Yahya Khan, who took power in 1969, reduced tension in West Pakistan by abolishing one unit and restoring the provinces, but failed altogether to conciliate East Pakistan. The West Pakistani establishment, including Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, founder of the Pakistani People's Party, PPP, were prepared to accept neither a loose confederation with East Pakistan, nor the democratic domination of the Bengali majority in a united Pakistan. During the years of protest against Ayub's rule, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman had emerged as leader of the Awami League, representing Muslim Bengali nationalism. Mujib's six-point program was a return to the original platform of the Muslim League in British India, demanding maximum autonomy for East Pakistan and reducing Pakistan to a loose confederation. Bengali radicalism had been increased by repeated clashes in East Pakistan between demonstrators and troops, and a catastrophic cyclone in November 1970 in which up to 1 million people died and the government was accused of negligence. In the December 1970 national elections, the Awami League won 160 out of 162 seats in East Pakistan, and an absolute majority in the national parliament. The PPP won 81 seats out of 138 in West Pakistan. Mujib therefore demanded the right to form the national government, with confederation the inevitable result. This was acceptable neither to Yahya Khan and the army, nor to the Punjabi elites, nor to Bhutto, who demanded an equal share in government on the basis of his party's majority in West Pakistan, and who forged an alliance with hardline military elements in Yahya's administration to resist Bengali demands. A series of moves and countermoves took place in the following months, accompanied by increasingly violent mass protests and clashes with the military in East Pakistan. Then at midnight at the end of March 25, 1971, the military launched a savage campaign of repression in East Pakistan, Operation Searchlight. Thousands of students, professionals, Awami League leaders and activists and East Pakistani police were killed, amid dreadful scenes of carnage and rape. This revolting campaign was the most terrible blot on the entire record of the Pakistani army, and was made possible by old and deep-seated racial contempt by the Punjabi and Pathan soldiery for the Bengalis, whom they also regarded as not true Muslims but crypto-Hindus. It is worth noting that, despite recurrent episodes of military repression, nothing remotely as bad as this has ever happened in West Pakistan, where this racial and racist tension between army and people does not exist to anything like the same degree. Indeed, unwillingness to fire on their own people has been one factor in undermining the will of the soldiers to confront the Taliban. Memory of the March 1971 massacres in East Pakistan has been largely suppressed in the Pakistan of today, since for obvious reasons neither the military nor the political parties, including the PPP, which after the death of Bhutto was headed for a while by General Tika Khan, who as commander in East Pakistan launched the campaign of killing there, nor the newspapers, which justified or ignored the killings, have any desire to recall them. The campaign led to the mutiny of East Pakistani troops, the Bengal Regiment, and a mass uprising in the countryside. Millions of refugees fled from East Pakistan to India with dreadful tales of the Pakistani army's behavior. 8 months later, with international opinion now ranged against Pakistan, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India ordered the Indian Army to invade East Pakistan, and in 2 weeks 96,000 hopelessly outnumbered Pakistani troops there were forced to surrender. An attempt to save the situation by invading India from West Pakistan was beaten off with ease. East Pakistan became the independent state of Bangladesh, and was recognized by the international community. Because of the vision of Pakistan as both a united Muslim homeland and an ideal Muslim state, the loss of Bangladesh has been seen by most West Pakistanis as a catastrophe which called into question the two-nation theory of Muslims as a South Asian nation equal to Hindu India, and therefore the very meaning of their country. In actual fact, it was only the terrible circumstances of the end of united Pakistan that were a catastrophe. Separation itself was inevitable sooner or later, and left West Pakistan a geographically coherent state whose peoples were also much more closely linked by ethnicity and culture. Pakistan has indeed demonstrated this by surviving, despite so many predictions to the contrary, and by the fact that despite a variety of local uprisings, until the rise of the Taliban it has never faced a challenge remotely on the scale of East Bengali nationalism. The new Pakistani state. In West Pakistan, however, despite the cynicism instilled by the later decades of Pakistani history, the initial idealism of the Pakistan movement, and its real achievements, should not be underestimated. Without them, Pakistan might not have survived at all. In Pakistan's first years, despite political turmoil, many Pakistanis displayed a level of energy and public service that they have never since recovered. These qualities were largely responsible for their country's success in overcoming the quite appalling problems generated by partition, the disruption of trade and the transport network, millions of refugees and growing tension with India. As Ian Talbot writes, Any of the refugees regarded their journey to Pakistan as a true hijrat, an opportunity for a renewal of their faith. Those who have grown cynical over the passage of time in Pakistan will be surprised by the widespread manifestations of social solidarity and improvisation, reminiscent of Britain during the Blitz in the Second World War, which marked the early days of the state's existence. The late Akhtar Hamid Khan, a former British Indian civil servant and founder of the famous Orangi Urban Regeneration Project, who moved to Pakistan after partition, told me in 1989 that, ridiculous though that may sound now, he and many younger educated Muslims had genuinely believed that Pakistan could be turned into a sort of ideal Muslim socialist state, drawing on Islamic traditions of justice and egalitarianism as well as on Western socialist thought. In the lines of the Punjabi poet and Muslim leaguer Chirag Din Jonika, the Quaid-e-Azam will get Pakistan soon, everyone will have freedom and peace. No one will suffer injustice. All will enjoy their rights. In fact, however, as with later attempts at radical reform, the first years of West Pakistan also turned into the story of the digestion of the Pakistan movement by local political society and culture, based on feudalism, kinship and conservative religion, an experience that was to be repeated under the administrations of Ayub Khan, Zia-ul Haq and Musharraf. All, in their different ways, tried to bring about radical changes in Pakistan. All were defeated by the weakness of the Pakistani state and the tremendous undertow of local kinship networks, power structures, and religious traditions. Any hope in the immediate aftermath of independence that reformist elements in the Muslim League might prevail against these traditions was destroyed by the premature deaths of Jinnah, barely a year after independence, and his prime minister, Liaquat Ali Khan. Without them, the Muslim League quickly disintegrated. This marks a critically important difference with India, which helps explain why these two offspring of the British Indian Empire have had such different political histories. In India, the charismatic leader of the independence movement, Jawaharlal Nehru, survived in power until 1964, and founded a dynasty which dominates Indian politics to this day. Thanks largely to Nehru, the Congress Party also survived as a powerful force. Indeed, although a democracy, until the 1960s India was in some respects, like Japan for more than 5 decades after the Second World War, a de facto one-party state. In Pakistan, no such party existed. Even had Jinnah lived, however, it is questionable whether the Muslim League could have continued to succeed politically as the Congress did. The League had its origins, its heart, and by far the greatest part of its support in the north of what was now India. Until shortly before independence, Punjab and Sindh were ruled by local parties dominated by great landowners, in alliance with their Hindu and Sikh equivalents, in Punjab, and with Hindu businessmen, in Sindh. The northwest frontier province was ruled by a local Pathan nationalist party in alliance with Congress, and Balochistan by its own local chieftains, several of whom opposed joining Pakistan. The leaders of the new Pakistani state and army were acutely aware of the thinness of loyalty to the new state across most of its territory, and this too helped create the mentality of a national security state, distrustful of its own people, heavily reliant on its intelligence services, and dependent ultimately on the army to hold the country together. The Muslim League was only able to supplant the local Sindhi, Punjabi and Pathan parties towards the very end of British rule, when the imminent prospect of an independent Hindu-dominated India stirred up profound fears in the Muslim masses of the region, and even then, the League was only able to prevail because it was joined by large sections of the local landowning elites, the first of the compromises between reformist parties and traditional local elites, which has been one of the dominant themes of Pakistani history. In consequence, the hopes of more radical elements of the League for land reform were soon buried. All the same, at the start the top ranks both of the Muslim League and of the bureaucracy were dominated by men from what was now India. This included Jinnah and Liaquat, and a large proportion of the senior ranks of the civil service. This added an additional degree of distance from local society to what were in any case not an indigenous state structure and legal system, but ones bequeathed by the British Empire. One might almost say that the composition and the achievements of the Pakistani state in its first 20 years were mostly non-Pakistani, a state structure created by the British and largely staffed by officials who had moved from the old Muslim territories in India. Outside the new Pakistan, a British-created and British-trained army, and an industrial class mainly made up of Gujaratis, also from India. In the decades since, this state has been brought into conformity with the societies over which it rules. In language too, the new state created a double distance between itself and the population. The new national language, inevitably, was supposed to be Urdu, the language of the Mughal court and army, and of the Muslim elites and population in North India. It was not, however, the language of any of the indigenous peoples of West Pakistan, let alone the Bengalis of East Pakistan. The strategy of forcing these populations to go to school in Urdu spurred local nationalist resentments in Sindh and the NWFP, all the more so as Urdu was not in fact the language of the top elites. These had come, under British rule, to speak English, and in Pakistan English, of a kind, has remained the language of the senior ranks of government, of high society and of higher education. The baleful effects of this on the legal system will be examined in the next chapter, while the idea that an Urdu education confers social prestige does not long survive any conversation with young upper-class Pakistanis, whose snobbish contempt for Urdu medium pupils is sometimes quite sickening. So Urdu found itself squeezed from both above and below. Attempts at change from above. Since the disintegration of the Muslim League in the early 1950s, Pakistan has seen 4 attempts at radical transformation, 3 of them in the secular tradition of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, and 1 in the Islamist tradition stretching back to Shah Waliullah. 3 of these attempts have been by military administrations, and 1 by a civilian administration. However, in a sign that Pakistani history cannot be divided neatly into periods of democracy and dictatorship, the civilian administration of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was in many ways more dictatorial than the military administrations of Generals Ayub Khan and Pervez Musharraf, just as for most of his time in power Musharraf's rule was if anything milder than the democratic government of Nawaz Sharif that he overthrew in 1999. Both main democratic parties when in power have used illegal and dictatorial methods against their opponents, sometimes in order to suppress ethnic and sectarian violence, and sometimes to try to maintain their own power in the face of multiple challenges from political rivals, ethnic separatists, and the military. In the gloomy words of a Pakistani businessman, one of the main problems for Pakistan is that our Democrats have tried to be dictators and our dictators have tried to be Democrats. So the democratic governments have not developed democracy and the dictatorships have not developed the country. That would in fact have required them to be much more dictatorial. But whether civilian or military, and more or less authoritarian, as pointed out in the introduction, all Pakistani governments have failed radically to reform Pakistan, in consequence of which, Pakistan, which was ahead of South Korea in development in the early 1960s, is dreadfully far behind it today. However, it is also worth pointing out that they did not fail completely. Generals Ayub Khan, Zia-ul-Haq and Musharraf presided over periods of fairly successful economic growth, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's rule, though economically disastrous, freed many Pakistanis from their previous position of complete subservience to the rural elites, and gave them a degree of pride and independence which they have never since wholly lost. In consequence of these achievements, if Pakistan is not South Korea, it is also not the Congo, which is saying something, after all. 2 Pakistani military governments tried to change and develop Pakistan in the general spirit of the westernizing traditions of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. I therefore have grouped the administrations of General Ayub Khan, 1958–69, and General Pervez Musharraf, 1999–2008, in one section. Ayub Khan came from a background that to some extent exemplifies the ethnic complexity of Pakistan, born in the NWFP, from a Pathan tribe but a Hindko-speaking Hazara family of small landowners. In a way, however, this was irrelevant. Coming from a military family, his father had been a Risaldar major in the British Indian Army, and having spent almost his whole adult life in the British Indian and then the Pakistani military, like Musharraf and a great many Pakistani officers, his personal identity was completely bound up with his professional one, as a soldier. While Ayub's family had been in the British military service, Musharrafs had served the British as administrators. Like Musharraf's father, Ayub had studied briefly at Aligarh University, which Sir Syed founded. Both men derived from this tradition a strong dislike of Islamist politics, and from their military backgrounds a loathing of politicians in general, yet both found that, in order to maintain their power, they had to rely on parliamentary coalitions made up of some of the most opportunist politicians in the country. In contrast to other military and civilian rulers of Pakistan, both men were personally kindly and tolerant, yet both headed increasingly repressive regimes. In striking contrast to most successful civilian politicians in Pakistan and throughout South Asia, neither they nor Zia-ul-Haq founded political dynasties or tried to do so. This was in fact impossible, above all because, although they ran what were in certain respects personal dictatorships, they were none of them personal leaders of what has been called the sultanistic kind, and did not personally control the institution that brought them to power. Rather, they came to power as the CEOs of that great meritocratic corporation, the Pakistan Army, and the board of directors of that corporation, in other words the senior generals, retained the ultimate say over their administration's fate. This marks the degree of the army's modernity, compared to the political parties. Both Ayub and Musharraf left office when the other generals decided it was time for them to go. As to Zia, no one knows who was responsible for his assassination. Both Ayub and Musharraf were committed secular reformers. Ayub in particular was bitterly hostile to the Islamists, and removed the Islamic label from the official name of the Republic of Pakistan. He promoted women's education and rights, and was the only ruler in Pakistan's history to have made a really serious attempt to promote birth control, correctly identifying runaway population growth as one of the biggest threats to the country's long-term progress. Like his reformist successors, however, Ayub was forced to retreat from much of his reformist program, in the face of the Islamists' ability to mobilize much of the population in protest at interference with their values and traditions, and the traditional landed elite's ability to block any moves that threatened their local dominance. Like Musharraf and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Ayub Khan expressed great admiration for the reformist secular policies of Kemal Ataturk, founder of the Turkish Republic, but all three of them failed to implement anything like Ataturk's program, for all the reasons that have made Pakistan since independence so different from Turkey since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Apart from anything else, Ataturk and his movement rode to power on the back of military victory against the Greek, Armenian and French troops which had invaded Asia Minor at the end of the First World War. Ayub's attempt at military victory over India in 1965 ended in failure, and the wave of nationalist fervor that he had aroused then blamed him for the inevitable compromise peace, and contributed greatly to his downfall. In the process, Ayub discovered the severe limits to America's alliance with Pakistan, to which he had committed his administration. Musharraf's experience in this regard was even harsher. Both Ayub and Musharraf followed strongly free-market economic policies, though, compared to Musharraf's, Ayub's administration did far more to build up the industry and infrastructure of the country. In one respect, Ayub went further than Musharraf, and further than any other government except that of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the 1970s. Ayub's administration introduced a land reform in 1959 which, if it fell far short of India's and was largely frustrated by the big landlords, nonetheless contributed to the breakup of the biggest feudal estates, and their transformation in northern Punjab, though barely elsewhere, into smaller-scale commercial holdings. Ayub's land reform in turn helped spur the successful Green Revolution in the area. However, this commercialization of agriculture, and the spread of mechanized farming also led to new unemployment and dispossession among agricultural workers and marginal tenants. These moved to the cities and swelled mass unrest against Ayyub. In 1962, Ayyub created the Convention Muslim League as a political party to prop up his rule in the face of political pressure that he could not crush through repression, because of his own character, the weakness of the Pakistani state, and the fact that the opposition adopted as its presidential candidate the iconic figure of the Quaid-e-Azam's sister, Fatima Jinnah. Ayyub's party was an alliance of independent local notables and bosses, and in no sense either a mass movement or a modern political party staffed by full-time professional officials and volunteers. The Convention Muslim League was therefore part of the familiar pattern whereby would-be reformist administrations have to depend on traditional, and strongly anti-reformist, powerholders to maintain their rule. This has always inevitably involved turning a blind eye to their corruption, and rewarding them with patronage which has undermined good government and the state budget. This was just the same with the Pakistan Muslim League, Quaid-e-Azam, or PML-Q, the King's Party, that Musharraf put together to support his rule and contest the elections of 2002. This party was made up chiefly of defectors from Nawaz Sharif's Muslim League, N, and was a typical grouping of opportunist landowners and local bosses. Musharraf was therefore also forced to follow the old pattern. Thus in his first years in power Musharraf pursued anti-corruption and revenue-raising strategies, which won praise from Transparency International and international financial institutions. In advance of the parliamentary elections of 2002, however, a whole string of cases for corruption, non-repayment of loans and tax evasion were dropped against politicians whose support Musharraf needed. In consequence, tax collection, which had edged up to 11.4% of GDP in 2001, fell again to its historic rate of around 10.5%, low even by the standards of the developing world. Given Musharraf's need for the courts to legitimize him and elected politicians to support him, it seems questionable whether he should really be called a military dictator at all. He was certainly a very weak one by international and historical standards. Musharraf followed Ayyub in attempting to increase the power of local municipal bodies elected on a non-party basis. In both cases, this strategy had both an opportunistic and an honorable side. The opportunistic element was the desire to weaken the opposition political parties by reducing the powers of the national and provincial parliaments, and reducing their access to local patronage. However, these moves also addressed a very real problem, which exists in India as well as Pakistan. This is that in both countries local elected bodies have traditionally had very weak powers. Real local authority has remained where it was established in British colonial days, in the hands of unelected civil servants whose powers are vastly more sweeping than those of their Western equivalents, including not just powers that in the West belong to elected municipalities, but some of those of the judiciary as well. Even under democracy, as far as most of their citizens are concerned, the Pakistani and Indian states therefore function more like elected authoritarianisms. The weakness of local government is especially damaging in the cities, where it hinders the development of new kinds of reformist urban politics. On the other hand, whereas in British days these civil servants were at least independent of politics and in a position to guarantee minimally honest administration, today they are not just responsible to the national and provincial governments, but are subject to endless pressure from elected politicians at the national and provincial levels. This gives tremendous powers of patronage and harassment to these politicians and their parties, but is extremely bad for honest and effective administration. One consequence is the constant transfers of officials on political grounds, meaning that very few have the chance ever to get to know their districts or areas of responsibility properly. Ayyub's basic democracy scheme and Musharraf's devolution were both meant to address these problems by giving real power to local elected bodies. In Musharraf's case, he also tried to strengthen the position of women by reserving a third of elected municipal seats for them. However, in both Ayyub's case and Musharraf's, after they fell from power, their civilian successors simply swept away these reforms, with no attempt to distinguish the good from the bad sides, in order to restore their own power and patronage. In Musharraf's case, however, his devolution was also widely criticized because he had weakened the police, contributing to several embarrassing collapses of local police forces in the face of Taliban attack. Musharraf had done this by removing the police from the authority of the district commissioner, the old British Burra Sahib, now renamed in rather politically correct Blairite fashion the district coordinating officer, and placing them under the elected councils. This was meant to address a terrible problem in Pakistan, and still more in India, the extreme unaccountability of the local police, which has contributed to so many ghastly atrocities against ordinary people. The problem was that the local councils proved wholly incapable of taking responsibility for the police. In consequence, the latter, with no one to force them to take action, developed a strong tendency when faced with any crisis simply to do nothing, not only because of natural somnolence, but out of fear that they would have to take the responsibility if something went wrong. In other fields of administration, too, the newly elected politicians proved too weak and inexperienced to exercise their powers properly, though they might have learned to do so given more time. There is something therefore both strange and tragic about Musharraf's devolution and its abolition. Strange that a military dictator should actually have weakened the state's powers of repression. Tragic that elected, democratic governments should have undermined democratic progress by weakening local democracy. But above all, tragic that a reform with some truly positive democratic and modern aspects should have foundered on the traditional hard realities of South Asian society. Local government reform was therefore part of Musharraf's declared spirit of enlightened moderation, which, though never systematically developed or implemented, nonetheless stood in the direct tradition of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. Some of Zia's Islamization measures were rolled back, and, as noted, a strong attempt was made to improve the political role of women. Until 9/11, Musharraf continued to support Islamist militants fighting in Kashmir against India, but at the same time confirmed his secular credentials by taking tough action against Sunni extremist groups which in previous years had conducted a savage campaign of sectarian terrorism against Pakistan's Shia minority. In 2008-9, these groups allied with the Pakistani Taliban and extended their terrorism from the Shia and Ismailis to Sunni Muslims from the Barelvi and Sufi traditions, as well as attacking state targets. Musharraf's administration differed from Ayyub's in two ways, one good, one bad. The good one was that, once again, very surprisingly for a military dictatorship, Musharraf introduced a radical liberalization of the media, something that he was to pay for heavily when the media turned against him in 2007. This reflected the fact that, as a great many senior Pakistanis who dealt with him personally have told me, until things began to fall apart towards the end of his rule, Musharraf was a far more open personality than either Ms. Bhutto or Mr. Sharif, and was genuinely committed to a form of liberal progress. The bad difference from Ayyub lay in the field of economic policy, and was perhaps a matter of Western influence as much as bad judgment on the part of Musharraf and his economic team. In Ayyub's day, Western development thinking was focused on the need to build a country's industrial base, and Ayyub responded with a very successful program of industrial growth. By Musharraf's time, however, the Washington Consensus and the capitalist triumphalism that followed the fall of communism had shifted Western attitudes to a blind faith in market liberalization and an increase in mass consumption. So while Musharraf's economic boom did lead to real growth in the economy and a real rise in state revenues, it was also much more shallow than growth under Ayyub and left a much smaller legacy. Musharraf's finance minister and, from 2004, Prime Minister, Khalid Aziz, nonetheless conducted for several years what seemed to be a strikingly successful economic policy. GDP growth, which when Musharraf took over had stood at 3.9%, only a percentage point or so over the rate of population growth, from 2003 to 2008 stood between 6.6% and 9%. Khalid Aziz's strategy, however, failed to deal with the underlying problems of the Pakistani economy. 36 In 2008, the advent of the world economic crisis led to a sharp drop in the economy, while acute electricity shortages revealed not only incompetence by the new PPP government but also the failure of the Musharraf administration to develop the country's energy infrastructure. Given Musharraf's personal honesty, in marked contrast to most of his predecessors, and progressive credentials, it is in fact depressing to note how little his administration achieved in 9 years in terms of changing Pakistan, though perhaps just helping to keep the country afloat in such times should be considered an achievement in itself. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Bhutto's government from 1971 to 1977 marked the only time a Pakistani civilian administration has sought to bring about radical changes in the country. His most enduring legacy was the creation of the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, one of the dynastic parties, with populist trappings, that continue to dominate South Asian politics. By contrast, Bhutto's attempts at radical reform largely met the same fate as those of his military counterparts, though with far more tragic personal consequences for Bhutto. Bhutto's combination of intense, feudal, and familial pride with an often vindictive hatred of the Pakistani upper classes has been attributed by many to the fact that his mother, Sir Shah Nawaz's second wife, was a convert from a Hindu family, inevitably, though probably wrongly, alleged by his enemies to have been a dancing girl. The miseries resulting from this for a sensitive child in an intensely snobbish and anti-Hindu milieu can easily be imagined. Later, the scurrilous and mendacious viciousness with which the anti-Bhutto press used his mother's origins against him must surely have increased his own savagery towards his critics and opponents. Bhutto was, however, also a child of his era, one in which left-wing nationalism was at its height in the Third World. When Bhutto founded the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, in 1966, Nasser was in power in Egypt, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nkrumah in Ghana, and Mao was the darling of the left-wing intelligentsia in much of the world. In neighboring India, Mrs. Gandhi was preparing to break the hold of the old Congress bosses on her father's party, by a populist campaign much of which was very close to that of Bhutto. Bhutto's slogan of roti, kapra or makan, bread, clothes and housing, was echoed by Mrs. Gandhi's of Garibi Hatao, abolish poverty. So Bhutto seemed to himself and others to be riding the wave of the future, though even before he took power Nkrumah had fallen and Nasser had been crushingly defeated by Israel. The basic dynamics of Bhutto's strategy were simple enough, and familiar enough from many such regimes elsewhere in the developing world. The intention was to bring about a socio-economic revolution from above in Pakistan, and to create rapid economic growth through the nationalization of industry and state-directed development. In the process, the support of the Pakistani masses for Bhutto and his party would be consolidated, and the PPP would become the permanent party of power, with Bhutto as the lifetime charismatic national leader who would then pass on this power to his descendants. Unlike the military rulers, Bhutto was therefore a would-be sultanistic dictator, personal and dynastic rather than institutional. 37 For Bhutto to achieve his goals, the grip of the existing elites on politics, the economy, and the bureaucracy would have to be broken, when necessary by ruthless means. It was highly unlikely that this program could ever have worked in terms of developing the country, as so many other international examples demonstrate. However, as these examples also demonstrate, Bhutto's approach might have worked much better when it came to consolidating his own power and that of his party. He could have ruled for a generation, instead of fewer than 6 years. The two differences between Pakistan and more successful examples of authoritarian nationalist populism are that for such regimes, to succeed in gaining a real, semi-permanent grip on power, they have to create powerful, organized parties staffed by new men and not the old elites, and, even more importantly, they have to control their armies. Very often indeed, like Perón, the populist leaders come from the ranks of the army themselves. Bhutto did not come from the military and, as will be seen, the military itself does not allow personal dictators from its ranks to establish dynastic rule. Nor was Pakistani society capable of generating a true mass political party, independent of kinship loyalties and local power elites. On the side of social and economic change, however, Bhutto acted rapidly and radically. In 1972, all major industries and banks were nationalized. This created a hostility to the PPP on the part of the capitalist classes which has continued long after the PPP abandoned every shred of real left-wing economics, and which largely explains business support for the PPP's opponents in the new Muslim League. Much more importantly, nationalization was economically disastrous. The move led to a flood of capital flight from Pakistan and a drastic fall in private investment for which the Pakistani state did not have the resources to compensate. Private investment in manufacturing dropped from an average of 992 million rupees in 1960 to 65 to 682 million rupees in 1971 to 6. While public investment rose only from 57 million rupees to 115 million rupees. By 1974 to 7, average economic growth per year had plunged to 2.7%, less than the annual growth of population. This compared to average annual growth of 6.8% in 1959 to 69, under Ayub Khan. Overall, Bhutto's populist economic strategy was therefore a disaster from which it took Pakistan an entire generation to recover. This was partly because state control of the large-scale commercial economy proved such a lucrative source of political patronage, that for a long time it was continued in several areas by succeeding administrations. Direction of the state companies was handed over as patronage to PPP supporters from inside and outside the bureaucracy, a task at which they proved both incompetent and corrupt. Nationalization contained a provision for partial workers' control in the form of workers' committees which were supposed to work together with management. In practice, these proved largely a dead letter. Over the succeeding decades, both trade union power and worker commitment to the PPP eroded, until by 2009 they were hardly visible in most sectors. Despite the genuine radicalism of Bhutto's measures in these areas, they did not go far enough for the left-wing radicals within the PPP. The socialist finance minister Mubashir Hassan had wanted the nationalization of urban land and the collectivization of agriculture, something that would have led to counter-revolution and bloody civil war across the country. When Bhutto reformed his cabinet in October 1974, Dr. Hassan and other left-wingers were excluded, and replaced by an influx of feudal landowners who had rallied to the PPP in the hope of patronage, especially in the nationalized industries. In the field of land reform, Bhutto was a good deal less radical than in the area of industry, but still more radical than any other Pakistani administration but Ayyub's. By a law of 1972, ceilings for land ownership were reduced to 150 acres of irrigated land, and to 300 acres of unirrigated land, from 500 and 1,000 acres, respectively. Under Ayyub's land reform, still big farms by Pakistani standards, but nothing resembling the huge estates of Pakistan in the past, or indeed of Britain and America today. This reform did indeed push agriculture in northern Punjab further in the direction of medium-sized commercial farming, and in Punjab and the NWFP, many of the great, feudal, political families of today derive their wealth not from agricultural land, but from urban rentals, for many noble families either had patches of land around the edges of the old cities, with villas, orchards and pleasure gardens, or were wise enough to invest agricultural profits in urban land, and 10 acres covered with houses and shops is easily worth 100 times the same acreage in the countryside. In much of Pakistan, however, Bhutto's land reform was to a great extent subverted. Above all, great landowners would on paper distribute parts of their land to junior relatives and retainers, rewarding them with a share of the proceeds while in practice continuing to control them. Especially in Sindh and southern Punjab, the kinship system yet again worked as a critical element of what has wrongly been called feudal power. Finally, and inevitably, Bhutto's reform turned a blind eye to many of the holdings of Bhutto's own landowning supporters, and own family. My travels with Bhutto's cousin, and governor and later chief minister of Sindh under Bhutto, Sardar Mumtaz Ali Bhutto, will be described in Chapter 8. He is a magnificent figure, a splendid representative of his class and caste, and about as much of a radical agrarian reformer as the Earl of Northumberland c. 1300 CE. Land reform faltered still more towards the end of Bhutto's administration, as his power crumbled, his party split, and he became more and more dependent on sections of the old landowning elites to keep him in power, a pattern which, as already argued, echoed the experience of Ayyub and prefigured that of Zia-ul-Haq and Musharraf. Growing reliance on the landowning elites reflected Bhutto's failure to consolidate his power through the creation of a disciplined, organized mass party and an effective seizure of the mechanisms of state coercion. Instead, repression under Bhutto took the form of sporadic terror against individual opponents and their families, something that only succeeded in infuriating the state establishment and the other political parties, without breaking their power. Bhutto was well aware of the need to create a disciplined cadre party. Ironically enough, he had given precisely this advice to Ayyub Khan when he was serving in his government, and Bhutto's plans for the PPP in some ways echoed Ayyub's hopes for basic democracy. But to create such a party across Pakistan, it would have been necessary to pay and to motivate its local cadres in such a way as to make them a power in their own right, and independent of local social and economic power structures. That has never been possible in Pakistan, because the state is too poor and weak, and local bosses, kinship groups and religious affiliations are immensely strong. Moreover, no party in Pakistan has been able to generate the ideological fervor required to turn its cadres into purely obedient and disciplined servants. The only exceptions are the Jamaat Islami and the Mohajer Qawmi movement, and for reasons that will be explored in chapters 6 and 8, they have only been able to do this on a local basis. Bhutto's failure to create a disciplined party also meant that local PPP leaders used the breakdown of state authority to set up their own private armed groups and local fiefdoms, and to engage in violent turf battles with each other as well as with the PPP's opponents. Lacking an effective mass party with real control over society, Bhutto was forced back on instruments of state control. He managed to a great extent to bend the bureaucracy and judiciary to his will, though in the process causing personal hatred which contributed to his death. The police were another matter. As successive Pakistani leaders have found, including in the struggle against the Taliban, the Pakistani police, though often savage enough on an individual basis, are an extremely unreliable force when it comes to mass repression. One reason for this is sheer laziness, exacerbated by bad pay. "Would you risk your life and run around in this heat for the pay we get?" was the response of many policemen to whom I suggested a more active approach to fighting crime, and, as in the rest of South Asia, it often seemed to me that brutality tempered by torpor wouldn't be a bad motto for the force as a whole. More importantly, from a force under the British which was to some extent independent of society and under state control, the Pakistani police at ground level had already become a force colonized by society, that is to say, whose officers and men as often as not were working in alliance with local kinship groups, landowners and urban bosses, classes which they naturally therefore were very unwilling to attack. Bhutto therefore set up his own paramilitary group, the Federal Security Force, FSF, staffed by PPP loyalists drawn from the most thuggish elements of the police and military, and by doing so, he can be said to have signed his own death warrant. It is not clear whether Bhutto gave specific orders to this force concerning the savage victimization of opponents and their families, but at the very least he played the role of Henry II concerning the murder of Thomas A. Becket. Who will rid me of this troublesome priest? On the other hand, just as the PPP was not the Soviet or Chinese Communist Party, so the FSF was not the NKVD. It was not remotely strong enough to terrorize Pakistani society as a whole into submission. It was, however, strong and vicious enough to raise hatred of Bhutto in sections of the elite to a degree not seen of any Pakistani ruler before or since. Hence in part the difference between Bhutto's fate and that of Ayub, Musharraf and Nawaz Sharif when they were overthrown. Ayub was allowed to live on in peaceful retirement in Pakistan. Sharif was eventually permitted to go into exile with his family fortune intact, and later returned to politics. Zia would have allowed Bhutto to take the same path into exile, but when the deposed leader made it clear that he was determined to return to power, and when mass rallies made it clear that he had a real chance of being re-elected, both Zia himself and all the leading figures who had helped bring Bhutto down knew very well what would happen to them, and more importantly their families, if he did in fact return to office. Bhutto's execution removed that threat, and by its very uniqueness stands as a reminder to Pakistani leaders of Machiavelli's lesson that in many societies men will far more easily forget an injury to their interests and even their persons than an assault on their honor.